Hello, everybody, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Tharries Podcast. I believe this is the 11th episode. I haven't actually recorded one of these in a while, but today, as always, I've got a very special guest. One of my personal favourite content creators on the platform. His retrospectives could honestly be official BBC products. I got Cleverdick Films with me today.
Hello. That's very flattering. Thank you.
That's fine. It's honestly a pleasure. It's so true that you can definitely see the effort that goes into what you make. For those of you who don't know, Cleverdick Films does a sort of review series of each era of Doctor Who, talking about the history behind it. Some really interesting stuff.
Yeah, it's well, that's great to hear because I mean, they do take a little bit of a while to get them made, and so it's lovely to hear that it's worth the wait and worth that extra little bit of anticipation to make sure that the final product is perhaps a little bit better than what people might be expecting perhaps on YouTube.
Yeah, so I think what you do is phenomenal. I frequently listen to your stuff while I'm editing my own stuff because I find it very relaxing. So it's fantastic. So while we're on the topic of YouTube, why don't you just tell me a little bit of the history behind your channel, where you got the idea to do the retrospective series from, just a general sort of background on your online presence.
Sure. Well, I have sort of been involved and fiddled about with media production for quite a long time, and I studied it academically at college and university. But for a very long time, I didn't really get to indulge that passion because I made the somewhat questionable decision of becoming a high school teacher, and found that I didn't really have much time to devote to things that I did. But a few years ago, I sort of made some changes in my sort of career aspirations and things, which, long story short, gave me a little bit more free time to be able to pursue other interests and hobbies and things like that. And it coincided, funnily enough, with I had obviously I grew up with Doctor Who, as I'm sure we'll talk about shortly. But I had recently, at that time, sort of started watching Doctor Who in order from the beginning, which I had never really had the opportunity to do before. And so I sat down and started watching them sporadically, and it gave me some interesting perspectives and views. And at the time, maybe I didn't search as hard as perhaps I could have done. But as you do when you're a fan of something, you look into other sources of different people's conversations and discussions and things like that. And so I looked on YouTube for videos that people had made about Doctor Who, because obviously I'd seen all the documentaries on the DVDs, and I thought I wanted to see what else was out there. I'd seen a few sort of like fictional action figure episodes and sort of creative stuff that people were doing, but I hadn't seen much from a point of view of analysis or documentary on it, and thought that would be an interesting thing. And what I found at the time was not really things that really went into depth about it, and I thought, well, here's an opportunity really. So I thought that could be my sort of thing really to do, and I thought, well, that would be relatively straightforward because I could do it myself. I had a microphone, I could record voiceover, I had an edit suite and sound software and things like that, and I thought that would be something relatively cheap and easy for me to do, to sort of dip my toes into it really. And so I rattled off a quick little intro video setting out my plan, and it was really a test really, because I thought, with using copyrighted material and things like that, am I going to run into real difficult problems? Maybe this is why I'm not seeing the programs I was looking for. So I uploaded the first sort of little introductory video where I set out, what Doctor Who meant to me and what I intended to do with the series, and uploaded that. And it was automatically struck by the copyright bots as soon as it went up. And I thought, oh, well, that's that then. But then when I appealed the decision, I thought, well, I've got nothing to lose, and I had no intention of monetizing it or anything like that anyway, because it was really just a way to indulge really in my favorite program and my media skills, put them up to the test. So the appeal went through, and the BBC said, or whoever it is at BBC Studios who reviewed it said, okay, this can be seen, but you can't monetize it. And I thought, well, okay, that's fair enough, because a lot of the clips I'd used weren't necessarily just for analysis. They were also to illustrate things. And people could split hairs and argue, well, it's an advertisement essentially for the BBC and for Doctor Who, so they should. But, my main goal was to make something that other people would enjoy, and anything else was secondary to that. And so from there, I thought, right, okay. And then that took a couple of months to see how that appeal went and whether, the whole thing would be a waste of time. And once that went through, I just started really, and as I meant to continue really, with looking at each Doctor as an individual era. And as I went along, the audience has sort of grown from there. I think it was the Tom Baker video really where things, the snowball started rolling really and picking up steam, because obviously everyone's going to look for Tom Baker, especially I think that's really probably the first point that people who have encountered the modern show will probably go back and look at when they're looking up Classic Who. They'll go, well, let's look at Tom Baker because he's, so iconic. Yeah, and so I think that's really how the audience started growing really, and it's sort of gone from there really.
So you talk about it growing. Was it quite a quick success, or did it take quite some time for...
Not really, no. It did take... I mean, I'm a very patient person anyway. And I never set out with the intention, as I think a lot of other YouTubers might do, which is sort of grow a massive audience and plaster things all over the beginning of the video before you actually get to the content to try and get people to follow you and all that. And I understand that, but I didn't really want to do videos like that because I found that a little bit obnoxious, to be honest. When I click on a video and I have to wait 2 minutes before I actually get anywhere, I thought, well, if people like it, then they'll follow it for that reason. So I didn't really aggressively market myself or anything like that. Perhaps if I had, things would have grown a bit sooner. I don't know, but I did create a Facebook page because at that stage I couldn't do community posts, and I thought, well, if people started following, I would be able to then update people using the Facebook page. But I also used that as a way of sort of spreading it and thought, well, you might be interested in this video that I've made. I must apologise. My dog is barking in the background. He gets very cross with anyone in the neighbourhood. It's his territory. So that might happen from time to time.
That's completely fine. Now, I can remember when I first was made aware of you, it was through, I think it was through Discord. Someone shared, I think it was the Sylvester McCoy one that I was shared, and basically after watching that one, I went back and watched the whole series from Hartnell to McCoy, and then obviously waited a while for the McGann one to come out, which is my personal favourite of the ones that you've done, not only because it's my favourite Doctor, but I also love the animated segment where you talk about the notes on Gallifrey and its origins. I think that was fantastic.
I'm really happy to hear that, because that was me sort of exercising my creative muscles a little bit. Although I'm not an artist, so none of those pictures were mine. They were actually sourced from a feature that had really taken my interest back in about, I think it must have been about 1998. It was in Doctor Who magazine, and it had pictures of Rassilon and Omega and the Pythia and things, and I thought, well, I'll take those images. Really, it's about the compositing. I also got to do a little bit of CG, not animation as such, but CG pictures. I had to visualize the loom bank that the other throws himself into. I sort of did that quickly, and I created the loom sort of glass chamber with the baby in it sort of growing. I created that, but it was just a way of trying to, I thought, as I've said before, that the one I was really looking forward to was doing the Paul McGann one, because that's the era in which I grew up. So obviously it's quite close to my heart, and I think that there was a niche there in a way of exploring some stuff that I think a lot of people don't look at so much, not just
Yeah.
Big Finish, but some of the comics and the novels and things like that. That's such a massive part of my fandom of Doctor Who, reading the Doctor Who books, that I wanted to do a feature on that, really. So I'm glad to hear that you enjoyed that bit, because that took me
fantastic.
3 or 4 days to do that tiny little segment, but I was quite pleased with it.
It was fantastic, and I would agree that I think that era of the show, the Wilderness years, is probably one of the most interesting periods of the show. But I think it just shows the resilience of the community in terms of the fact that despite that there was nothing on, and what we did get, obviously, TV-wise, was things like Dimensions in Time, you know, but we managed to survive it, and I think that just goes to show the willingness and the sort of creativity of some fans, obviously, because as you said in that video, it's where a lot of the Doctor Who people, I suppose, that we have now, such as like people like Russell T Davies, got their start doing Virgin New Adventures and things like that. So I think we have got a lot to thank the Wilderness years for, that quite often goes overlooked. It's just sort of remembered as that gap period between classic Who and modern Who.
Well, I think in a way you could see it partly as a kind of like that sort of period as a sort of way where the show was kind of experimented with and refined, and people got to think and reflect on what works and what doesn't work, which then massively informed when the series came back. I mean, there's a really interesting article in. I cannot remember which issue it was in now, but there was an issue of Doctor Who magazine a few years before the show came back, and they interviewed people like Mark Gatiss, Russell T Davies, Stephen Moffat about, you know, what would it be like were it to come back now? How would it have to change? And I remember there was a famous quote by Russell T Davies saying, "Oh, God help the guy who has to bring it back." Like, I don't, which is quite ironic, really.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think people, because there's that discussion about the show, and it's become kind of like a cultural, it's not a bit cliche, but it's sort of a cultural icon, but also a product of culture, which is, I think, the good test of anything that's going to last is, you know, do the audience take it and adopt it, and it becomes in a way greater than the original creators and the individuals who have contributed over the year. It's become like an ongoing myth in a way, and so that period really helped it sort of put it in the pressure cooker, really, and filter out and kind of hopefully concentrate down to what are the key elements so that it could be successful when it came back.
Yeah, I agree. I think when you look at the Virgin New Adventures as well, you see a lot of inspiration that New Who took. Obviously, with things like Human Nature and Family of Blood, that was originally a Virgin New Adventures novel that was adapted for TV with some changes, obviously. So I think we've got a lot to thank for that period of the show that, again, not a lot of people give it credit for. But so obviously in your first episode about Hartnell, you talk about your sort of family history with the show, how your mum basically found out about it when the first episode was released. Yeah. So I wanted to ask you how you were exposed to it, because obviously, as you said, you grew up in a time where Doctor Who wasn't necessarily on the air. So who was it? What was it that actually first showed you the show?
Well, I can't remember. That's how long ago it was, really. It's really before I was aware of, well, before I was really forming memories. I may have seen it when it was on, but I don't distinctly remember watching it on its original transmission at all. And I doubt the images and the memories are so, you know, because I was born in 1984, so I would have been 5 when the show went off the air. I have an older brother. He's 6 years older than me, and when we grew up, we were both into science fiction, and I kind of idolized him. So, you know, everything he liked, I liked. But because he was 6 years older, he I think had a broader view of things. You know, he had watched Doctor Who, he had watched Battlestar Galactica and all these imports from America and things like that. My mother has always been interested in fantasy and science fiction. She's not a fan of these things, you know. Not only because she's not really of that generation where fandom existed, but she doesn't take it as seriously as the rest of us. Yeah. So I always had these sort of influences of things like Tolkien and science fiction behemoths that had come along and dominated. Things like Star Wars, Star Trek, all those kinds of things were on. The Next Generation we watched as a family, although actually a lot of the time it was on later. It was on after my bedtime, so I used to hear I could get very jealous of my brother because he got to stay up and watch that and Red Dwarf and things like that. So I was sort of really my childhood was very much kind of about stories and about these sort of flights of fancy and fantasy things, and Doctor Who was a part of that. I don't remember specifically sort of becoming aware of Doctor Who any more than I really remember becoming aware of Star Wars. It was just something that was there. It was part of our sort of culture, really. And I suppose in a way, because I was fortunate in a way to be born when I was, because Doctor Who, although it wasn't on television when I was little as such, it hadn't been off for very long. And so it was still part of the, in a way, yeah. And there were commemorative, there were repeats and things like that, because when it first went off the air, it wasn't definitively sure, or wasn't at least made clear that it wasn't coming back. There was an anticipation that it was going to come back in some form or another. Yeah. So people didn't think of it as dead as such. Yeah. I think really, it had become by that point such a part of our British culture that everyone sort of knew of Doctor Who and the Daleks. They're that iconic. But I think really probably the point at which it became something more than just one amongst the others was around the 30th anniversary, because we were very lucky when I grew up to one of the first houses, I think, on our neighbourhood to get Sky TV. And so I could watch UK Gold, and UK Gold had recently acquired sort of the rights to show all of Doctor Who. And they did a little sort of 30th anniversary celebration over a weekend, which I recorded on a tape. And it was very bizarre, I've mentioned before, because I can't remember how they decided on the episodes. I think it was by some sort of popular vote, but they didn't show whole stories. Because, of course, Classic Who was episodic, but you'd have like 6 or 7 installments in a program. So they would show one episode of 4. And so it was completely out of context. I had no idea what was going on, but I was still sort of fascinated by it when I saw the last episode of Logopolis, and there was an episode of Warrior's Gate and things like that. And that really just sort of took my imagination. I think what really stood out about Doctor Who for me, as opposed to the other interests, the other programs that I sort of shared interest in, was the fact that BBC was Doctor Who was unique in the fact that it was made by the BBC in Britain, and so there was a sense of a different kind of cultural influence on it at that time. And I think also the fact that it was, for me, I think because I got into Doctor Who when I was so young, I kind of looked past a lot of the sort of visual shortcomings. My dad would sort of scoff at things like that. But I didn't mind. I recognised that some of it was a bit hokey. I recognised that it wasn't as lavish as say, something like Next Generation at that time. But for me, I actually found that quite inspiring, because it felt like, first of all, it didn't matter to me because if the story was good and the actors believed in what they were performing, then I looked past that much in the same way that I would say if I watched a stage play, which didn't have, not one of these massive productions that you get on in the West End or something with millions thrown at them with amazing set design, but the regular plays that you'd go and see where the audience is encouraged to use their imagination for those visualizations. But I think also because I thought, look, they've made a spaceship out of a fairy liquid bottle or something, and I could do that too. And I think that was the thing, was I was whenever I enjoyed programs and films and books and things like that, I always saw it as sort of aspirational to me. It was like, it encouraged me to think, well, I'd like to have a go at that, So I've always read lots. I've written things as well, and worked on my sort of style, and then photography and filmmaking and sound recording and things like that all came, I think, from things like Doctor Who and how it kind of inspired me in a way that perhaps Star Wars, although I love the story and the mythology and things like that, didn't inspire me, because I thought, well, there's no way I could possibly achieve the kind of results that they've got, or at that time I didn't know how they were achieved. For me, ironically, kind of being able to work out how things were made and how they did it was kind of more interesting and more inspiring to me. Yeah. I think so, yeah. And I mean, I always wanted to make little films and things like that. So I think that Doctor Who is sort of simultaneously sort of a favourite show, but also a massive part of my character and how I grew up, and what I went on to do was inspired and influenced by that.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think for me, myself, I've mentioned this before, I grew up the sort of, I'm kind of younger than you, not to be offensive at all, but I grew up in sort of the Tennant kind of era of the show, and obviously that was probably when it was at its, I guess, at its peak in terms of pop culture relevance.
Yeah, definitely. Probably yeah.
Between that point,
so it was comparable to the Tom Baker era, I think, in the general public's enjoyment of it.
Yeah, between that point and the 50th, I would say is when I would say it's like it was at least massive to me, and like I know a lot more people talked about it then than perhaps they would even go on to later on. But I would agree that I think I grew up with both. I was very lucky to grow up with both, because I was sort of introduced to both at the same time, classic and modern Who, I mean. So I always sort of saw it as the same show, whereas I know for a lot of people the divide is very clear between classic and modern. There are some people who only like classic or only like modern, but to me, I was very lucky to grow up with both. And obviously my first classic story was Tomb of the Cybermen, which was an excellent introduction to the classic show as well, obviously, because with the opening line, it explains who the Doctor is, the TARDIS, the companions. It basically sets.
Yeah, it is like a reboot, and not a reboot as such, but it is like a refresher as such. It was, I think, it was seen as an opportunity, really, as a jumping on point for new viewers in a way.
Yeah, and so that was my first, episode. And like yourself, I think I acknowledged that it was from the past, if you like. So I didn't scrutinize it for the way it looked, I suppose. Whereas
from a modern perspective,
from a modern perspective. Whereas I know a lot of people can't jump on board with classic Who because the visuals are such a stumbling block to them. Which of course there's nothing wrong with that. That some people, I like nice effects, but for some people it's more of an issue than others.
Yeah,
I think. But yeah, I think that's very interesting. That obviously you grew up at a time without Doctor Who. Yeah, your fan was still able to grow exponentially.
Yeah, well, I think it's because that period with nothing new on gave the opportunity for me to go back and explore all that history. I mean, that was the initial thing, was that 30th anniversary sort of period and getting into it. And then, but I think really it was the Paul McGann film when that came out that really kicked my sort of interest into an obsession in a way, in the fact that I thought, well, I want to indulge this interest. There's only one thing it's been on, and maybe there'll be more, I don't know, and I really want to explore this more. So then I started getting Doctor Who magazine, which I've got monthly ever since 1998, and discovered the books and all the sort of spin-off media, and really it just sort of grew from there, really. A sort of fascination. And at that time as well was a great sense of excitement, ironically, in a way that nowadays, of course, if you want to look for it, you can generally find anything you want. But at that time, it was a bit more difficult. I was very much reliant on either Doctor Who magazine or UK Gold, which were screening complete stories every Sunday, and they were doing them sort of in order. Obviously, they couldn't show the ones that have missing episodes in or things like that. But and I used to record them every weekend and then watch them. And so, really, I really started to sort of really immerse myself in all the media and the mystery of, what does Power of the Daleks look like? And, nowadays I can go on and find a screenshot or whatever of something from that time and discover things, or you can look up clips on YouTube, even if you can't afford to buy the DVD and things like that. And but at that time, in a way, it was arguably more exciting because there was like this pursuit that you did. It wasn't easy as such to be a fan. And that made me a much more sort of resilient fan, I think, as well, because, it wasn't something you could easily indulge in,
I think, going back to what you were saying about, obviously you remember seeing the TV movie, I think I'm one of those rare beasts that genuinely really loves the TV movie.
Yeah.
I love the set design, particularly the TARDIS. I think it's the best TARDIS we've ever received in terms of like a live action TARDIS, I suppose, because obviously comics kind of do their own thing sometimes, and Big Finish as well. But in terms of live action, the Paul McGann TARDIS is always been my favourite. I just think there's something so mysterious yet homely about it, and I think what a brilliant way to encapsulate the character of the Doctor, being mysterious yet comfortable at the same time.
Exactly. I like that aspect sometimes of the TARDIS having a sense of being lived in, even if you're not in the TARDIS. I think it's a mistake to go too far, and perhaps like they did in the 80s a lot, which is to spend too much time in the TARDIS. After all, the TARDIS is a literal vehicle that gets the characters into the plot. But at the same time, I kind of find it, I don't know, maybe it's just the autistic side of me wanting things to have this kind of logic, but I think, this person this is his home, especially now or until recently where Gallifrey didn't exist anymore. Well, this is his home, and it should be lived in. And I've always been less fond of the more sparsely filled interiors like the Tennant TARDIS and definitely the Jodie Whittaker console room, which kind of has that sense of size, but at the same time it's sort of black, and you think, well, does anyone go anywhere else other than that room? I find it, I don't want to see them necessarily sitting in their bedroom twiddling their thumbs or something, but I want a sense of it being lived in, and that's why I'm particularly fond of the Capaldi interior. I know it's the same for Matt Smith's latter era, but with Capaldi, they filled it with the books and the blackboards and things like that, and I like that sense of, this is I think the TARDIS itself is an integral part and a fascinating part of it, and I really, really love, one of my favourite shots of the entire series is the very first time Barbara and Ian walk into the TARDIS interior, and you see that massive set in its full glory, obviously reduced quite a lot later on for space, but I just really like the idea, that this is a lived-in space, and I think you're right, the McGann one really fits that bill. I wish in a way they hadn't spent so much money on the set that they didn't have it so much for other things, but still, that was definitely, that could have proved to have some really great sort of scenes and things later on if the series had picked up from there. They had that standing set.
I kind of love McGann as the Doctor and his TARDIS so much that it does kind of make me wonder what life would have been like if the show was continued. Perhaps, dare I say it, maybe some of the ideas from the Leakley Bible were used, or maybe some new ideas were incorporated. It will always be something that I wonder about, because I just love the overall design and aesthetic of it. I really liked Grace Holloway as a companion. I think she's one of the more underrated companions.
I agree, and definitely when I was writing the episode about Paul McGann, I was really reflecting on Grace and thinking, actually, she's pretty good. She, as a companion, as someone who, is in a way the audience identification figure, or is meant to be. She fits that bill, but also she's not. She's pretty active and involved without upstaging the Doctor as such, and I think that's a difficult balance to strike. You either, I think the temptation is to sort of do what Terrence Dicks did a lot, which was make the companion quite a weak and pathetic character who needed saving, because that was his perception of the companion and what their purpose was. And I don't think that's entirely true. I think Grace could have been a bit like Romana in a way, as kind of almost like the Doctor's equal, but still in some way, reliant on his wisdom and his experience, but quite an independent character in that sense.
I think one of my favourite lines from the movie that sort of perfectly encapsulates what we're talking about is when she's talking about, that would explain the interdimensional transference. It's like,
Yeah.
I liked that. I think she is, in many ways, the template to the modern companion, in a similar way to how Ace was the more sort of, the template of the more physical companion. I think Grace was the template for the more intellectual companion that we'd quite often go on to see in New Who. Obviously, Martha being a doctor. You had Clara, who was just inexplicably good at everything.
Well, I think I mean, there's a great. You mentioned Ace there. I think there's a great. I don't know if they intended it at the time, but in Dragonfire, when she's introduced, I think it might be the cliffhanger to. It must be episode 2, because of course the first episode is that ridiculous, the literal cliffhanger where Sylvester McCoy randomly climbs off the side of a literal cliff and hangs by his umbrella for no discernible reason. But the second episode cliffhanger, I think it was, when the dragon approaches and you've got Mel and Ace next to each other, and Mel does her pitch perfect scream and Ace is absolutely silent and just looks slightly worried at the approaching terror. And I think that's a great sort of visualization of classic Who and modern Who combining in a way, because that latter era, certainly that last season, is remarkably similar to the revived era in 2005. I mean, Survival itself takes place in the kind of suburban streets that Rose picks up in a few almost 2 decades later in a way. So yeah, I know what you're saying about how people sort of compartmentalize and see them as 2 separate things, but I think the Wilderness Years kind of adds to that, really, because you've got that gap. I think if Doctor Who had continued on television on the BBC, by the time we got to 2005, it would have been pretty similar to what we actually got, because I think that the way stories developed, the way characters are represented, and the way things were filmed kind of evolved between those 2 points. I like you, I see it as one program, really, one kind of mythos as such, and I don't see that gap, because you can do the same thing. If you look at, say, a 60s story of Hartnell and compare that with a Sylvester McCoy story, you're going to see an enormous difference in pacing, in writing, in character thing, and it's the same thing, really, when you see that gap between the 80s and the 2000s. And even now, I think arguably, if you look at, say, a modern episode, a Whittaker episode or a Capaldi episode, not just in the visual quality, but also just in the way that the program is made, and you compare that with 2005, you can see a marked difference as well.
I think one of the things that's probably not aged the most about modern Who is probably the Lazarus experiment. I think like you compare that now to some of the CGI we have with Capaldi and Whittaker, and it's just like you just realize how in such a very short time how far this show has come.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
My personal headcanon always was, if the classic show was to continue up to now, it would have kind of looked like Curse of Fatal Death. That was kind of my opinion, like my sort of headcanon theory.
Yeah, I mean, Curse of Fatal Death has that sort of multi-camera setup that a lot of classic television was shot on. I think, but throw a little bit more money at it, I think it would have been very similar.
It wouldn't be like the same amount of money, but I think it would have had a very similar. I think it probably would have become a bit more self-aware, because at that point you kind of have to, especially if they did have people like Moffat behind it. Obviously, because we went on to have Moffat behind it, and he is known for making jokes, laughing with the show, and to an extent laughing at it. But I'd say that that's to an extent part of the charm of some of his writing in particular. That's something I think as well. That if you look at the difference between RTD and Stephen Moffat, RTD sort of has the sort of whimsical memories of the past. When you hear about Sarah Jane talking about previous companions,
Yeah.
Whereas I think Moffat understands how hokey, well, in his writing anyway, he sort of understands how hokey it was and kind of pokes a little bit of fun at it from time to
Yeah,
time.
but as you say, it's sort of an affectionate to
Oh
poke
yeah,
fun.
no, yeah, it is an
What
affectionate.
I've always appreciated about Stephen Moffat in comparison to Russell T Davies is that I would never want to undermine the fantastic achievement of Russell T Davies in bringing the show back, but I always, and when I look back at certainly sort of the first two seasons of New Who, if you want to call it that,
Yeah.
is the fact that I think he thinks very much in the short term when he's creating things.
Okay.
How is it going to present now to this audience now? And of course, that's what you want really as a writer, as a producer, as a production company. You want to capture that geist now. But I think in the I would argue that a lot of that sort of era is actually arguably more dated than perhaps some of classic Who. It's less timeless in the pop culture references, for example, and
Yeah, the long game being a good example with all the game show references, half of which don't exist anymore.
No, I know. Yeah, that as a fan, that kind of the sort of anal fan in me finds that slightly awkward. That it's like, how would Trini and Susanna exist in 200,000 years? You have to kind of take that logic with a pinch of salt, I think. But it's also references to Il Divo, and I think McFly are in one, and I do really, and I do really love the fact though that he got Anne Widdecombe to sponsor the Master, thereby essentially saying that her logic and her political decisions are completely untrustworthy, and she didn't even realize this. She was just desperate for a bit of cash, I think. But I think it's that kind of existing in the now. Everything's quite fast paced. I remember reading something about, I don't want to sound like a snob or something, but I think that Stephen Moffat's influences were perhaps a little bit more timeless, a little bit less of the zeitgeist, in the fact that I do remember Russell T Davies apparently saying, although I'm not sure how the years match up with this, but he said that his inspiration for World War III and I've forgotten the name of the other episode, but the two-parter with the Slitheen in
Aliens of London.
That's right, Aliens of London and World War III. Apparently, he was inspired by the music video that Girls Aloud did for Love Actually, where they're dancing around in Downing Street. Apparently, that was his primary inspiration for it, which I found interesting. And I just thought, well, that kind of sums it up in a way, and it's this very kind of, that was good for the show in a way, because it captured a modern thing, it broadened it out, I think, to an audience, but personally, I prefer things that are a little bit more timeless than that. That inspirations come more from themes and ideas that have been around for a bit longer, perhaps. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that's one thing that things like the TV movie did excel at, where, like, to me, that felt like it could take place pretty much anywhere at any point in relative modern society. Like, I wouldn't say that it, obviously the only thing that would date it slightly is the fact that obviously it does take place on the turn of a new millennium. I'd say that's probably the only thing that does age it.
I think though that, I mean, for about 5 or 6 years that was kind of like the linchpin conceit of a lot of stuff. Everything was, that's a convenient date. And I remember when the millennium was coming up and pretty much every product seemed to have 2000 after it, to try and make it cool and happening. Even Blues Brothers 2000, there's absolutely no reason why Blues Brothers 2000 is called Blues Brothers 2000. You just added 2000 because that happened to be the year in which it came out, I think. So they could have just called it 2. But it became like this almost like this running joke in a way, that everything seemed to be happening on December the 31st 2000. And why in Doctor Who it's even more tenuous, because you're thinking it's just sort of conveniently happening at that time of the year.
In the TV movie, it is very much just sort of happening at that time, just because there's no real reason. But going back to what you're saying about obviously Russell T Davies and Stephen Moffat and the difference between those, I would agree. I think Stephen Moffat is a bit more of a sort of, I suppose, if he takes more unique inspirations. Whereas I think Russell T Davies takes more relatable
Yeah,
inspirations.
yeah,
Obviously, they're two different styles, and there's nothing inherently wrong with either of them. They're just two different ways of
yeah.
doing the same thing. The one thing I'll always give RTD credit for is that he was consistent, I suppose. Whereas, even though obviously Doctor Who is a show that's got room for experimentation, I feel like some cases Moffat just went that little step too far with some things. Personally to me, things like Hellbent, the hybrid, certain things like that.
Yeah, I think that went away. I mean, that season, really, I think you definitely get a sense that Stephen Moffat is kind of not necessarily running out of ideas, but he's a bit tired of it. And I think that the hybrid thing and the perhaps unsatisfactory element of that, although I do like the little nod in the last episode of that, Heaven Sent, isn't it? Or is it Hellbent? It's Hellbent, isn't it? The last one.
Yes.
And he's talking to me in the future, and she says about where do you come from? Like, are you half? Maybe it's half human, half Time Lord. And there's kind of little nod there to the kind of Leakley idea and the side joke in the film with Paul McGann saying that he's half human on his mother's side. So I like those little. I do like it when he worked in those little sort of nods to fans kind of thing.
I also liked it when
but
he
yeah,
said
I
that,
think
the canon Doctor had watched the Doctor Who movies with Peter Cushing. I can remember where he said that the Doctor loves those movies. And I was like, that's quite a cool way of incorporating Peter Cushing into the canon, I think, even if
that's one thing. I mean, I really liked about Stephen Moffat is that he knew these little bugbears that fans have sometimes and sort of worked it in. And sometimes I think people think, there's, it's indulgent or whatever, but I always liked it. I know people loathe to some extent some elements of his series, but I actually really liked when Missy says that he used to call himself Doctor Who because he thought it was more mysterious. And I know some people hate that, but it actually really makes it because for years and years, I'm sure you're aware, in the War Machines with William Hartnell, the evil supercomputer Wotan says Doctor Who is required over the end credits, and everyone for years is like, we'll just have to ignore that. He's not called Doctor Who, he's called the Doctor. And of course, that in one quick little side joke in a way in that story, he solves that problem that Wotan is calling him by his chosen name and that he dropped the Who.
Also in
I just like those little things.
Every classic episode up to, I believe, Tom Baker, he was always credited as Doctor Who.
Doctor Who, absolutely. Which kind of thinks that did they not realise that the show they were making? I suppose had they done, they would have insisted at the BBC in the 60s to put the question mark, which should be there. But of course, I think John Nathan Turner made up for that later on with his pullovers and things like that Sylvester McCoy wore, just to drive the point home.
I think if we're being honest, I know if I was the showrunner, if I was put into Moffat's position or RTD's position or Chibnall's position, I would probably indulge in references. I think it would be in a fan's nature to reference certain things, even if perhaps it probably doesn't always fit. I feel like there's a part of us that's always going to want to.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's that's why, like back in the Wilderness era, when people were discussing, who should bring it back and how should it be done, the general consensus was, it shouldn't be a fan because a fan would make it too continuity ridden. And in the end, we got fantastic New Who, but it was made by fans and it has been taken to the heights of brilliance by fans. But it's about balance at the end of the day. And to go back to the Paul McGann film, that's what I think they don't always have. It's enticing, perhaps, for those of us who are into sci-fi, even if we didn't know about Doctor Who, some of the references that are in that film. But to a general audience, I think there's a balance to be struck between kind of a throwaway thing that you don't have to get in order to enjoy it, and having massive info dumps about exposition that aren't really relevant and can confuse and alienate an audience. There's things that work as little thing like the sonic screwdriver in the Paul McGann film is fine. As a general audience, it doesn't matter. The fact that it's exactly the same as when it had last been seen, as a little added thing for us to enjoy. The seals of Rassilon on things, they're just window dressing, literally, a lot of the time. But having Skaro and the Daleks, despite the fact that they sound terrible and we don't see them, but having that little extra bit is just, I think, confusing. And I think that's why Russell T Davies learned from missteps like that when he brought it back, he didn't contradict and think, we've got to reboot it all, but he just thought, well, what are the key elements? And as we go on, we can throw in little things, and I mean, some might argue that perhaps it's gone too far the other way, or did with Capaldi, perhaps, and sort of getting a bit too continuity laden for new audiences to really get into. But I think that that was addressed somewhat with the last Capaldi season.
And then I would also kind of argue that with sorry to interrupt you there, but
no,
just for the latest series, I feel like we've just gone in the complete other way, where it's like, there's been
perhaps distancing itself from completely, but I think that I think that it is always about balance. I mean, I think you can compare, perhaps, we were saying about general awareness and the general public sort of enjoyment of things. You can compare in some way the 50th anniversary period with the 20th anniversary period, in that it became very, very aware. And it was to general people that it was this big anniversary. There was reruns of a story from each of the previous Doctors on television, which at that time was completely unprecedented. In the 80s, most people didn't have video players. You couldn't get access. So to see Patrick Troughton's story or John Pertwee story was a fantastic thing. And then there was this big convention where they didn't think they thought it would be quite niche, and hundreds of thousands of people showed up to go to it. And there was this big thing in the 50th anniversary story. And then after that, they thought, well, that worked quite well. All these continuity references, all these things coming back from the past. Let's now try and incorporate as much of that as possible. And that's where you get Peter Davison's sort of season 20 with something from every era before, and then that carrying on into Colin Baker with Attack of the Cybermen, where you've got this ridiculously convoluted story, which is a sequel to a story, Tomb of the Cybermen, which at that time no one, even if they wanted to watch it, couldn't watch it because it was deleted from the archives at that point. It hadn't been found in Hong Kong or wherever they discovered it. Unless you were a really ardent fan and had really studied the novelization of Tomb of the Cybermen, I think you would have been very lost at what the hell was going on. And so that then, I think part of that, along with some of the decisions that were made about the character of the Doctor, and that alienated an audience way, and so kind of laid that groundwork for the lack of support when it came to the show going off the air in 89. So I can kind of see why it was important perhaps to make that course correction, sort of refresh the show. And I hope that going forward there will be a little bit more little sort of Easter eggs and continuity references back. But I think that they approached the Whittaker season very much as perhaps Moffat approached the first season with Matt Smith, at least the first few stories, in really kind of rebooting the show and refreshing. I can understand it from a program creator's point of view of why that might be necessary. But yeah, as I say, it is all about balance at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I think in truth, I think we all have the ideal way that we would like to see the show done. But that way that we conjure up in our heads realistically probably couldn't be made into a TV show. Actual thing.
Yeah. Or perhaps, you've got to think about the appeal of that show and how broad will that appeal be? Will it just, if it's just being made for me, then it's going to be brilliant. But you've got to think of that wider audience as well, because it is. We, in a way, we say we don't own the show, and that's true. I don't own Doctor Who, but at the same time, we all own it, being an audience, and there are different iterations of that, and some we might not like. There are eras of Doctor Who that are not my favourite, and I don't particularly enjoy as much as others, and somewhat controversially, Russell T Davies's era is probably the era that I least enjoy. But that's not to say I don't love it and I don't appreciate it, and there's some absolutely fantastic stories. But maybe I'm just a grumpy old fan. You know, I like Doctor Who the way I was. But at the same time, I wouldn't level any accusations of saying they've done it wrong or they've ruined it or something, because they didn't, and I enjoyed it when it was on. And there's different, and perhaps controversially, I would argue that Stephen Moffat's version of Doctor Who, certainly in his first season with Matt Smith, is probably more aligned to the kind of Doctor Who I like. And again, that's going to have detractors, and some people would see me as kind of maybe sacrilegious being a fan of classic Who and all this kind of thing. But that's the kind of thing that I like. And so therefore I think you have to take the rough with the smooth kind of thing, and there's decisions and ideas, but I recognize that it isn't just for me, and there is an audience that of people, a massive audience of people who enjoy those iterations that I don't. I think one of the things that I found really, really heartening, I went to London Film and Comic-Con in the summer, and I met Colin Baker again, which was very lovely. But while I was there, obviously you've got people dressed up and everything, and I saw loads of young kids, loads of young girls dressed up as the 13th Doctor, and I thought, that's just really amazing. I mean, they could be dressed up as the 10th Doctor or whomever, but it always kind of brings a warmth to this old grumpy heart when when I was growing up with Doctor Who, it was almost like you felt like you had to buy a porn mag to hide your Doctor Who magazine in because it was less embarrassing.
True, yeah. I get that.
That must be, I don't have the perspective of someone who's discovered it since, as such, but for me, I grew up with Doctor Who, and at that time, not being a particularly gregarious person, it was me and my friend who sort of enjoyed Doctor Who and watched it, but it was really kind of a sole pursuit for me. There wasn't a network of people who I talked to. I knew there were fans out there because I read Doctor Who magazine, but I didn't go to conventions. I did eventually go to a convention when I was 16, but I was sort of on my own. My parents took me up there when I finished my GCSEs, and they went off, and I was sort of at the convention, just sort of wandering about, meeting these stars, and it was more of a solitary pursuit in a way, and so the popularity of it and the enthusiasm of groups of people is somewhat surprising. It's always a surprise to me because it's something that I didn't grow up with.
Yeah. Would you also say that, like, with the advent of the internet, it's kind of supersized the fan base of Doctor Who to a degree, if you like, because obviously these people who might not have necessarily met before could easily discuss Doctor Who at their leisure and also watch it at their leisure, because obviously with things like the internet, with current technology, it makes things a lot easier. Example being, I've ponied up the money and subscribed to BritBox now. So when obviously the classic episodes go on to that, I'll be doing my own sort of marathon of each episode, and I'll probably end up re-ranking each incarnation of the Doctor. But going back to what you were saying about your controversial statement about not liking RTD as much as others, for the longest time, I really didn't like 12, and I know a lot of people now who rank him extremely highly, and I wouldn't personally rank him as highly, not so much because of the performance, because Peter Capaldi, in my opinion, is a fantastic actor, but more so because of the way he was written, particularly around Series 9. I can understand why people rank him highly, I really can, because there are moments of which his Doctor in particular shines. I think the Zygon two-parter with the speech, basically any time he's giving a speech is probably when he shines.
He does do speeches rather well, doesn't he? And that's something that I have missed a little bit with Jodie Whittaker's Doctor. I quite liked the moment when she was tied up and she was talking to King James about superstition, about fear and difference and things. I like that part, but I think she doesn't necessarily get as much time to shine, and I think some people will argue that she wouldn't shine or she doesn't shine, but I think that's a result of the fact that she has 3 companions. And if you look back at eras of Doctor Who where there has been a crowded TARDIS like that, the Doctor is less, it's more of an ensemble, it has to be, and therefore the Doctor is less of a beacon as such. And you look at Peter Davison's eras, arguably as well William Hartnell, although you've got to take into account they had a longer time to tell the stories and pace was a bit slower, so the characters could have more time in the sun, so to speak.
To be honest, at first when I heard about the idea of them being there being 3 companions, I thought, okay, that could open it up to some new perspectives. But the issue I had, particularly with the way it was handled within Series 11 and some previous series as well, is that it does prevent the character development of the Doctor to a certain degree. Even with like Capaldi in his early days, a lot of focus was put on Clara. I know there wasn't 3 people in the TARDIS, but she did seem to get more focus than the Doctor did, and that kind of is how it feels right now with Graham.
Yeah, definitely. I think what perhaps might have been a better way to achieve more focus, perhaps on the Doctor, would have been to introduce those companions more gradually. So, like for example, a bit like Rory was introduced but didn't become a companion for a while. So by the time he did, the character of the Doctor and the one companion was sort of more solidified as such. And I think perhaps, I don't know, it's kind of a callback to earlier eras, but at the same time, you've got to take into account you've got 10 episodes essentially, and they're 45 minutes, and that's drastically shorter amount of time to tell the story. And of course, the way that stories are told these days at a much faster pace, running literally from one bit to another, it does reduce the opportunities to really allow the new Doctor to really shine. I think Peter Davison is the same, and I think he felt the same, because it was only when he was doing Caves of Androzani and he realized, he thought, oh no, I've made a mistake here, I should stay. But he had made the decision to leave, not based just on the stories, but I think also on the fact that as a character, as an actor, he didn't really get much opportunity. And I think when you look at the 5th Doctor, he really, really shines in Caves of Androzani. There's a reason why people love that. And I don't think it's purely down to the grittiness of the script and stuff, which I think was the misstep that Eric Saywood and John Nathan Turner then took following that, make everything as gritty as Caves of Androzani, where everyone's, sadistically hurting each other all the time.
I mean,
but I think it's more the fact
like,
that...
Vengeance on Varos and things like that. But
not
for everything, I don't think.
No, you've got to have some balance. But I think the reason why Caves of Androzani is so good is because the Doctor's character and his goodness and what he stands for shines all the brighter in contrast to those other things. And also the fact that it's just him and one companion. And actually that companion is incapacitated for most of the story. So it's really just the Peter Davison story. He actually gets to be the Doctor much more than he had an opportunity before. And I think... I like the companions in the modern series. I think Yaz is underdeveloped, and I hope there's going to be more of that next series. But, again, with the time that they've got to tell the story, it was really focused more on Ryan, and I've forgotten his name, Bradley Walsh's character, Graham, yeah. And I think that you probably want to drop one of them.
Yeah.
Going forward,
I've got a video planned on basically how I would rewrite Series 11 with all the same actors, basic plot lines and everything, but just how I would have done it instead, and how I would have developed all the characters. And I think what my main thing would have been to do was to basically have flashbacks to 13 going on adventures with a young... Is it Grace, the grandmother?
I think so, yeah.
Going on adventures with a young Grace, but Grace ends up almost getting killed or something, which leads to a sort of, perhaps a sense of kind of guilt, kind of a sort of a Time War-esque thing, but on a lesser scale. So I think the Doctor would feel less sure of herself and more hesitant to jump in, whereas before... Obviously, with most incarnations of the Doctor throughout their entire run, they don't hesitate to answer help. I think having a more vulnerable kind of like a sort of reluctant Doctor, I think that would have been the way I would have took it. And then slowly, as each episode goes on, build up her confidence. So in the final sort of finale with what's his name, Tim Shaw,
Yeah.
in Battle of Ranskoor av Kolos. I still can't always say it. I can remember in one
Well, it's
video.
like Raxacorical Fallopatorius, isn't
Yeah.
it? It's one of those.
Yeah, I can remember calling it in one video the Battle of the name I can't pronounce, because that's basically how I remember it. But
Yeah.
in that episode, basically, obviously the return of Tim Shaw would be kind of scary for 13, because obviously he killed Grace before. Well, he almost killed Grace once, and then he actually did it in Women Who Fell to Earth. So then
reminding her of the cost of these things. Yeah.
And then also that rivalry between, because I think they were trying to make Tim Shaw the big villain of Series 11. At least that's how it came across, with the fact that he was the main villain of the finale.
Yeah.
And in that case, I feel like you've got to build up the dynamic of those two characters more than what they did.
No, I agree. Yeah. I think that's the thing, really, that I think perhaps a lot of people are missing, perhaps, is that angst the Doctor can sometimes have. And I think the character of the 13th Doctor is much more of an enthusiastic and sort of willing adventurer who doesn't seem to have any issue with confidence. And I think that's a marked difference, perhaps, definitely a marked difference to Capaldi's incarnation. But also, to some extent, I think David Tennant as well. There are times there where he had that weakness shown, and perhaps that's what's needed a little bit more of going forward. In that self-doubt and that notion, very much so, that Moffat built up, that idea of the Doctor is an ideal that he aspires to himself, or she. That it's a character that he chooses to be. And he's not always perfect.
I've always said I think she needs an arc, because as of right now, I can't remember who said it originally, but someone just said she's like the one in the group with the really cool car. She's the one who drives people to places back and forth.
Is she the lead? Yeah. I get that. I think there will be a bit of a game plan going on. I mean, you've got these. You probably know more about it than me, because I tend to avoid a lot of speculation and things like that.
Whereas I sort of cover a lot of the speculation and the
whole timeless child and things like that. I think there's something going on in the background there.
I hope so. I hope it wasn't just a throwaway line that Chibnall forgot to bring back. It
seems a bit too random for it, doesn't it? It seemed very Russell T Davies-esque, of that dropping the thing and everyone sort of thinking about it for a moment. But maybe it'll be like the crack in the wall kind of thing that drags out and comes back unexpectedly much later on. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I hope it does lead somewhere. I personally, obviously, you said you weren't a fan of the Tennant. I'm not a fan of what I've seen of Chibnall and his vision of the show thus far. I'd love to be proven wrong in Series 12. Obviously, it does seem like they've listened to some of the criticisms, obviously, with bringing back classic villains, which was a bone of contention for many fans. So I do think that Series 12 might be a slight improvement over 11, but I'm not getting my hopes up, I don't think. Obviously, because if you don't know, basically the genesis of this channel was me sort of venting out my frustrations over Series 11. Like many fans before me, including Chris Chibnall, I was just sort of
that's the irony, isn't it?
I was just talking about my issues with the current state of the show, and obviously I still have my issues with it. But I think, obviously, it's important to recognise that we've still got like 55 years of the show previously.
Well, absolutely, yeah. And that's something I've mentioned before. I think that for me, Doctor Who is such a massive part of my life and a part of my general enjoyment and entertainment. I watch things, I read things, I listen to things, I write things, I create things. It has been for as long as I can remember such this massive thing. And especially with my videos, I'm kind of critically assessing them. I'm analysing it. I'm doing a kind of guide and documentary at the same time. But in a way, I think that I'm someone who I wouldn't say I easily forgive, but I kind of I can put aside issues and things and enjoy it for what it is in a way. It's kind of like I don't know if you ever saw, but back in the day, Charlie Brooker used to do a series called Screen Wipe where he talked about television programs. And he's generally quite a cynical person, and it was quite amusing in his cynicism. But he did do a feature back on Doctor Who back when I think it must have been Tennant's first series, and he said about how for him Doctor Who bypasses that adult cynical mindset and taps right into the inner 10-year-old boy in his brain. And I would say I'm very much like that as well, in that I don't. It means simultaneously such a massive thing to me and who I am and what my life is, but I'm not so precious over it that I can't overlook missteps from time to time. And I don't know if that's a benefit of growing up in the wilderness era where for me, Doctor Who was something that was in the past and something that had been done, that there wasn't any kind of concurrent sense of ownership as such over it. But yeah, I enjoy. I can adapt. I've never had that feeling, which I think a lot of classic fans who watched it when it was on originally and modern fans who watch it now, where the new Doctor comes along and there's kind of typically a reaction to that amongst the general audience. Oh my God, who's this one? Yeah. I mean, and that's what I found very enlightening and interesting when I was doing research for my Patrick Troughton story, to actually find the they didn't have Twitter and things in those days, but they did used to do audience appreciation reports, and they'd go and talk to people. Yeah, the comments of, oh, he's a clown, oh, they're not taking it seriously, I can't do this. And to contrast with the fact that now Patrick Troughton is generally considered as, one of the best doctors of all the run. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Boggled Eye, Buffoon, things like that. It's
little boy didn't like the new Doctor.
Yeah, he was. Yeah. And it's such it goes to show, not to say that those concerns or those interests aren't valid. I'm sure, there's not for everyone, but it does go to show that these things are quite a common reaction. And I've never really had those because I got into Doctor Who when 7 people were the Doctor to me, and they were simultaneously, because I could watch William Hartnell and then I'd watch Sylvester McCoy. There wasn't a continuity or a linear appreciation of it for me. It was discovering bits and pieces and fitting this big puzzle together in my mind. And so I bring that somewhat to when I watch it currently, for me, in my mind, because I read the books and listen to the audios, and I see all that as legitimate media, even with the continuity contradictions and things like that. It's all part of the ongoing mythos, really. And I, for me, Capaldi and Tennant and John Hurt and they're all the Doctor currently in my mind. They're still the Doctor. They continue to be so. I think I don't see it in that linear fashion, and so perhaps I'm not as upset as other people when there are missteps or mistakes made.
Yeah, no, I completely understand that perspective. I think I was having this discussion with someone the other night. It's like, I personally want the show to continue for as long as it possibly can. I know a lot of people said that it's run its course by now, but I personally am one of those people that want to see the next generation of people get a turn to have their say on how the show is done, obviously. But I think that's why I think I was so frustrated in the beginning. My stance, obviously, I'm still not a fan of Series 11, but I think I've sort of mellowed slightly from that sort of person.
Initial reaction.
Yeah. Because when it was first announced, obviously with every Doctor, there's always going to be skepticism, and there was skepticism when 13 was announced, because I was kind of like, with the way that things are, currently with the sort of political climate that we seem to live in now, there was that sort of concern in the back of my mind that was saying, this might not go so well. But I said to myself, like every Doctor, I'll give it a chance. And, I watched pretty much all of Series 11 before making that first video. And I guess it just didn't impress me, and that was, I suppose, upsetting. It just wasn't my cup of tea. And
Yeah.
yeah, I think I saw pretty glaring issues, and I think that is frustrating. It's kind of like when you watch a game show, and you watch someone get the answer wrong,
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah.
and you know that answer's wrong,
Yeah.
and you're sort of screaming it at the TV. That's kind of how it feels when Doctor Who does something wrong. And this is not just Series 11, but it goes for, obviously, Series 9 I'm not a fan of. You know, a bunch of other series that I'm not a huge fan of. There's, you know, it feels like there's a solution that they just don't see. And it might not even be right, but in your head, it is. You know?
Yeah. Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think that's something we all have as fans. We all think we have the solution of the way to fix the show. You know, I've had some lovely comments of people saying, "Oh, you should be showrunner." I'm like, no, I really shouldn't be. I don't have the vision or the.
Yeah, I've had a few of those myself, and I agree. Yeah, it's but it sometimes it is. You know, when you've got a finished product and it goes out there, you know, you can judge its merits, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the decisions that you had made would have worked necessarily, you know. And I've certainly felt that before, having, you know, grown up with films and things like that, and then attempted to make my own and studied at university. It's kind of like when you get into it, you realize how difficult it actually is to kind of visualize what it is you're intended to do. And I think the more of an institution that thing becomes, and how you know, everyone is entitled to criticize it, but that puts a lot of pressure on it, you know. I think that I think it's about some of the core values of something, and certainly when you're taking on a program that's existed for such a long time, you know, are you maintaining those core values of the show, and what it means to, you know, why it captured the zeitgeist in the first place. You know, what was it that makes it what it is? And I think it's about staying true to that. I think that's why a lot of people actually dislike the Paul McGann film, because they don't see it as Doctor Who as such. And especially at the time, what was quite interesting actually is the fact that nowadays a lot of people, before but also since, especially the Night of the Doctor, have seen Paul McGann's Doctor as this kind of, you know, fantastic incarnation. But for a very long time he was considered amongst fandom as this kind of you know, like Paul McGann himself said, the George Lazenby of Doctor Who, and this idea of a failed experiment,
kind of ugly stepchild type thing.
And people wanted to reject it and just completely ignore that continuity. And it was Russell T Davies really who kind of sealed the wax, really, in saying, you know, he is the Eighth Doctor and Christopher Eccleston is the Ninth Doctor, and therefore legitimising it in the continuity.
And then had the War Doctor complicate things.
Yeah, there is that. But you know, it's interesting to see how things evolve and how people's appreciation changes over time, with the retrospect and the benefit of hindsight, and seeing where things are going. I think one of the things that complicates the issue with the current Doctor Who is the general debate and discussion about representation and agendas and things like that people believe in and stuff. And I think that sometimes that needlessly complicates it and draws it away from, well, what is the finished product? What have we got here? You know, because sometimes agendas, rightly or wrongly, can result in and perhaps cynical sort of corporate agendas and virtue signaling can sometimes result in greatness. Because, for example, a lot of the foundation of what we think of now as cinema is down to a decision when in America, where all the studio system had been owned by businessmen, but people who were very much involved in the creative side of things. And in the early 70s, when that all kind of fallen apart, they either died or retired. A lot of big film production companies were sold on to big corporations who, you know, made everything from ice cream to, I don't know, sanitary towels or something. You know, these people who, you know, they make products, but they think of everything in numbers and statistics, and they don't understand art as such. But they looked at that terrible thing, demographics, and realized that, you know, there was an emergent young group of people who had disposable income, and so they said, well, we'll hire people to make films for those people. And that's how Scorsese and George Lucas and Francis Ford Coppola and all those people got their kind of step up really to make the films that they did, which then really arguably laid the groundwork for modern. Have to be careful when I say cinema in these days because of Scorsese's comments the other month, but this idea of modern films and what, things like Jaws came out and revolutionized what cinema could be, and of course Star Wars and things like that. So, sometimes from a cynical agenda to kind of get cash out of people, you can produce very worthwhile artistic things. It's always that balance. Any kind of film or TV or anything really, book, is a balance between kind of corporate interests and art, and that eternal debate. So, I think at the end of the day, to expect corporations or companies to do anything other than for their own financial gain is to kind of be a bit naive about the way the world works and the way money is made. But within that doesn't mean to say that everyone who's involved in that product that comes out of that agenda is as cynical and as exploitative as that, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I know that obviously I've obviously made a fair few videos on the current era because it's what's hot right now, I suppose.
Yeah.
But I think I've talked about the political stuff before, but I think like at this point I'm sort of not so much moving it out, but sort of making that element of it less, because there are elements of the show that I think could be improved other than just its politics. I think I think there's elements of it that I'd like to see changed that can be done, because
it definitely needs to be more subtle. I mean, that's the fact. It is. You do get people that are very vociferous and argumentative about things and say, "Oh, it's turned into this PC." Blah, blah, blah. But Doctor Who has always been dealing with issues and presenting, the liberal viewpoint generally as the correct one, with some missteps from time to time.
But as you said, it's all about the way it's done, I think.
How subtle that is and how it's worked in. But I think that's partly as a result of the fact that geopolitically at the moment things are more explicit and debates are more unsubtle, shall we say. But I think that art becomes more timeless when it becomes more applicable to different things. It's a little bit like the foreword to the second edition of Lord of the Rings. J.R. Tolkien kind of did a rebuttal to a lot of people because, like Doctor Who, he'd written this product, I used a horrible corporate phrase there. Yeah. He wrote this book, which certainly became a product and really captured the imagination, something that he'd worked on for decades, and had lived with. And people got massively into it and were incredible fans of it and detractors of it. And what he kind of got annoyed by was how fans would contact him and say, "Oh, thank you for writing this, and this is brilliant. You're talking about the atom bomb. You're talking about nuclear warfare, blah 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 blah. You're talking about homoerotic issues." And he was aghast, being a kind of a man born in the Victorian era in the upper class of England, that the idea that Frodo and Sam could possibly be gay he found completely horrifying. But nevertheless, there are those themes to be explored. And what he said, which I found quite interesting, is the fact that he says it was never an allegory. It was never a story that is meant to stand for specific topical issues in the world. But he said the phrase I prefer is applicability, that idea that you can take these themes and these ideas and you can apply them to, the ring as a symbol of power. It could be an atom bomb, but it could be, a gun or something. It could be anything that gives you power and control over other people and can corrupt you into being an authoritarian leader or something. It's this applicability which I think is more lasting. If you can take those issues, they may have been inspired by events, so they may have some topical applicability to the people at the time in which it was written, but they can still apply today. I think the Daleks are a great example of that. Yeah. The inspiration for them was the Nazi ideology and the experience, which was less than 20 years old, of that horror and the results of that kind of rhetoric in Europe. at the time which was written, but it's still applicable today because the notion of racial purity and intolerance and hostility towards that is something that still applies in our current, and you can apply it to other things. You could apply it to any other culture or things that are going on in the world right now, and I think that's more what should be aimed for than a specific unsubtle reference to a topical issue which will age it and make it less timeless in the same way that Il Divo and McFly did in the Russell T Davies era.
Like the more I completely agree. I was about to say the more overt it is, the less timeless and more dated it becomes.
Exactly.
And I would also say that while yes, it's important to cover certain political issues, because of course it is, I would also say don't let it get in the way of what really matters about the show, which is the story. To me anyway. And I feel like in some cases, Doctor Who doesn't do that, and it actually balances story and politics excellently. Obviously, you got things like Genesis, or just anything with Davros in it, quite frankly. Great sort of allegory.
Remembrance of the Daleks, particularly.
Remembrance. Yeah. Also,
the reason why I love that story so much, and clearly it is a lot of people agree with me, because it just came second in this World Cup of the Daleks that Doctor Who magazine just ran. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I've spoiled that for you a little bit.
No, that's fine. No.
But it came as a runner-up. I think it's kind of obvious what's going to be in the top 5 anyway, really. But Remembrance. What I love about that is the fact that it is reaffirming and it's re-examining what the point of the Daleks is and what they stand for and what they are a symbol of, rather than the, creepy aliens. And that's something that Robert Sherman felt very strongly. He hated that idea of how real villains, if you want to call them that, of history, but also fictional ones that are representative of real world villainy, can be reduced to comic book characters. He hated the particular scene that he referenced was in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, where Indy has infiltrated the Nazi castle in Austria, and he looks over and there's all Nazis and things on the phones and printers or whatever, and he says, Nazis, I hate these guys. And it's kind of like a cheapening of what they were and what they stood for and what they are. I mean, they're the baddies, but to reduce them to kind of boo hiss baddies makes us think in a comfortable way that could never happen again, and that people could not be guilty of making the same mistakes. And I think that's also what the Daleks represent.
It's kind of sugarcoating history almost, I would say.
Yeah. It's reducing it, isn't it, to cartoon villains and baddies.
I think a good example of that to reference Martin, who would probably be the Trump guy in Arachnids. To me, he felt very, very pantomime, very, I guess.
I think that's also a product of the fact, again, that you've got the constraints of a 45-minute episode. You've got to have a monster in it. You've got Yaz's family that you're sort of introducing and embellishing a little bit, and he does become a kind of 2D cutout. I think that it would have been, if you're going to have a character like that, because really what that story was about kind of corporate greed and ethics and things like that, which is very applicable. That can be explored it needs to be explored in a little bit more depth, I think, the subject as well. And then that was very reminiscent of the Green Death, which I think does it more in a more sophisticated fashion.
I don't know how well versed in Big Finish you are, but I've recently been listening to Davros for a review, and that talks about corporate greed and basically the sort of behind the scenes politics of corporations excellently, and the different ideologies behind different corporations, because obviously Davros wants to use TAI as basically his kind of way of setting up new wars, and he thinks that the best way to increase productivity is for there to be war. Obviously growing up on Skaro, that's something that he felt, because during the war between the Thals and the Khaleds, obviously they were...
Well, you never see a poor weapons dealer during a war, will you?
they were very productive. They knew exactly what to do, and they were everyone went along with it because it's war, and you're not going to
Yeah.
disagree during wartime.
No,
There's
it's not the time for it. They say, yeah. Well, that's what Siegfried Sassoon during the First World War had the same objection to that, didn't he?
They're basically going to go along with whatever you tell them. So I think that's how Davros vies for power, particularly in that story. Is he uses the idea of war to not only further his own beliefs but also force everyone into submission. And I think that's an excellent way of not only showing the politics of war, but also corporate overlords as well. Kind of does both. Excellent.
But I think that's where the script editor or the showrunner as influence needs to come in more. I think perhaps Chris Chibnall had a little bit more of a hands-off attitude towards the writers that he'd commissioned. I don't know all the inner production side of it, and they're very sort of play their cards close to their chest in comparison to the previous two eras. But I know that Stephen Moffat was more heavily involved in the other scripts that were commissioned, to the point at which he was essentially rewriting them, and he got to a point where he thought, I'm not going to not take credit for this anymore, which is why you start seeing a lot co-written by Stephen Moffat in the credits. And so maybe Chris was a bit more hands-off in that sense, because there are some bits that could be, it's not that they're invalid, but they're not really explored or developed the way they should be, and so perhaps they should have been dropped, because the real core point in Arachnids in the UK is all about the corporate ethics, the lack of ethics, and also the fact that at the end, they're worried, they've kind of not humanized, but in a way we empathize with the spiders, and we empathize with the situation that they're a victim as well, and then essentially what do they do? Well, when we put them all in a room and suffocate them, essentially. That, if I remember rightly, that's how that story ends, and no one really comments on it.
And everyone's like, "How dare you shoot the spider?" Even though...
and then let's kill them all. And it's kind of it needed a tweak. It needed a different ending, or at least some sort of more hand-wringing and justification over that eventuality than what we get, which is kind of a convenient sort of ending.
Like myself personally, I can't imagine the Doctor making creatures suffer as opposed to giving them a quick, painless death. I don't think that felt out of character to me personally. Maybe some people felt differently. Maybe they thought that the Doctor would never purposely kill anybody. But well, I mean, other than the time...
Well, I mean, there's a kind of a complicated thing of that in the past. I mean, if you look at like Sylvester McCoy's Doctor, when he frequently manipulates people into destroying themselves and can be quite vengeful in some way. There's a bit of a hypocritical element sometimes with the Doctor, and the fact that he overthrows governments and then buggers off and lets everyone pick up the pieces is kind of, it can be, there is a precedent for that kind of quick ending and off you go kind of thing, and not thinking about the consequences. That's the reason why I really like Face of Evil with Tom Baker, where he first meets Leela, and the fact that that's in a way a sequel to an off-air story where he came in and thought he'd fixed it, but actually caused in the long run a bigger issue, where the robot, the computer of the ship has sort of taken on his schizophrenic personality.
Yeah, same with Long Game and The Parting of the Ways. The Doctor basically, goes on to, I think it's called Platform 1. Fixes it, gets rid of the what do you call it?
The Jagrafess.
The Jagrafess, and also the sort of the chips that they install into people.
Yeah.
But what does that
and
mean?
Then arguably sets up the future for the Daleks to come in
because
and
it makes
take
them, it leaves humanity basically at its most vulnerable point, allowing the Daleks to, as you said, sort of interfere with that. But I think that was actually explored in that two-parter, whereas I feel like
I think that's what they need to do more of next season, is perhaps see more the consequences of and for the Doctor to have some angst over it, and to not be a perfect, because I think the Doctor never has been perfect. There have been moments where he's been brought up and hoisted by his own petard kind of thing, and been reminded of his responsibilities and the consequences of his/her interference in things, going all the way back to the original Doctor. The whole Dalek story happens because the Doctor is selfish and greedy and wants to go into the city of the Daleks.
No one likes perfect characters. They're not
no.
interesting, you know.
We need flawed heroes just as much as we need flawed villains, you know.
It's why a lot of people can't relate with characters like Superman as much as they can with some of the more flawed Marvel characters, say Iron Man, for example, because they are so godly, you know. It makes them
sort of whiter than white,
Yeah, it makes them hard to relate to.
And arguably, the best stories that involve those ones are where they then explore how arguably quite fascistic those characters are, you know, like Superman being this kind of god who decides what's right, you know, in the kind of Watchmen way of, you know, these are not necessarily people that we should look up to and trust and give over our rights to.
Or even something like in Waters of Mars, where the Doctor basically just goes, the laws of time are mine, and they will obey me. I'm the one who decides who lives and who dies. Yeah. And I think that's the closest thing we get to like the Doctor sort of becoming the Master incredibly quickly. It just shows how quickly that side of him could take over, and the fact that it doesn't, I think, is very interesting about the Doctor's character.
But that's why I think that led then directly, sort of narratively speaking, to that concept of, you know, the Doctor is something that he aspires to, and I think in a way, I don't know whether Chibnall agrees with that sort of narrative sort of motif in a way, that thread. But I think he should. I think you should bring that in a little bit, that idea that she is fallible and that the Doctor that she aspires to be, she doesn't always get it 100% right all the time.
I want to see her make some mistakes. I want to see her mess up some stuff. Because right now it just seems like everyone agrees with her and she's always in the right. And that's going to get that does get boring. You know, she's I remember watching a video, I believe it was by someone like the Critical Drinker, and it's basically, he says like she's followed around by a group of yes men, and to an extent very true. You know, they always basically go along with what the Doctor says.
They don't. There's never an argument really between them, as there not really been, and I can't really think of a Doctor off the top of my head who never had that pushback. I mean, maybe John Pertwee, but even then, especially with Liz and especially with Sarah Jane, there were times where there were arguments between them and them questioning his methods.
And like as well, I would say, going back to what you said about John Pertwee, like obviously sometimes, you know, sometimes Sarah Jane was right and sometimes the Brigadier was right, and sometimes you know there was never just one person who was always right all the time, because that as I said, that's going to get boring, that's going to get repetitive, and it's not really realistic to say that someone's going to be perfect 100% of the time, even if they are an alien Time Lord with 2 hearts and, as Matt Smith comedically puts it, 27 brains. But I think that's an important element of the character that needs to sort of come back, and I would like to see it.
I can only imagine that the reason why we didn't see much of why it was sort of turned down so much is because I think that was a big element of the Capaldi era, of not knowing who he was, of you know, am I a good man and things, and am I going to avenge the things. I don't think that they really explored it as well as they should have done or could have done, and they kind of retconned it a little bit and made it more touchy-feely, didn't they?
Yeah, I mean,
but that idea of that angst and that difficulty, I think perhaps it became a bit too overindulgent. I found by the point where Capaldi regenerated in his final speech, I don't know, I found that I really dislike David Tennant's final regeneration scene, because I think it becomes I don't want to go, and I like how that was kind of retconned in a way that perhaps in that moment he was thinking about where he was headed, that perhaps he remembered in that moment that the 11th Doctor telling him that, you know, we're headed for Trenzalore kind of thing. That's how I like to think of it anyway, to kind of make it a little bit more emotional. Well, because that's, of course, when he goes in the Day of the Doctor, he says, we have to get another destination because I don't want to go. And then he says, he always says that. And in my mind, that kind of made up for it a little bit, because I thought, well, maybe in that moment, in that regenerative moment, it's occurred to him, you know, what the next incarnation is going to be. That's the final incarnation, and they're headed for Trenzalore. Maybe that's what he's talking about there, because the alternative is, of course, he's talking about himself, and I really don't like that kind of indignant, childish element of the Doctor there. I
No,
think
I
that, you know, and it kind of, in a way, it was almost like challenging the next era to live up to it, and I thought that was a bit. I'm sure that's not what he intended, but it kind of felt a bit mean spirited in
it
that
does kind of
sense.
come across as if like,
I don't want to go, so you shouldn't want me to go either, kind of thing,
this
right?
new one's replacing me type thing.
Yeah,
That's
exactly,
how it
yeah.
kind of, you know,
Rather
can,
than being the same person, you know.
yeah, that's
Uh,
how it can be, perceived as.
but I
Um,
found the Capaldi one quite indulgent as well, where he's
oh
running
yeah,
about the console, going on
I
about pairs
think it would
and
have been
things, and I
much
thought,
more effective if, obviously, I know with Chibnall he didn't want to do a Christmas special, causing Moffat to last minute script Twice Upon a Time, and in my opinion it shows. Um, but
yeah,
with his final speech, it just seems so long and tacked
yeah,
on, and it's like, how many speeches do you have to give before you just
yeah.
shut up and change already? It's like,
Yeah,
I
which is
feel
not how you should feel when the
I,
Doctor's
I feel like
regenerating.
it should. I feel like it should just be. It would have been so much more effective if in Doctor Falls, he regenerates then. Maybe we didn't have a Christmas special. I'd have preferred that over getting Twice Upon a Time. Yeah, it would have been a shame not to see David Bradley in the role, but
Yeah.
at the same time, I didn't really like the way the first Doctor was handled either. So
Mm, mm.
it's, yeah. But
Well, I think that yeah, I mean, it's that idea of subtlety again in overindulgence, and it is guilty of that from time to time. I don't know really if we can blame Russell T Davies a little bit for that, of that idea of not being subtle, because I think there's certainly, whether you love him or you hate him, I think there's one thing you say with Russell T Davies, that he was never really subtle.
no,
And it's
I'm
that
the
kind of
last.
emotional, chasing the emotional thing, and you
I'm the
know,
oncoming storm, the last of the Time Lords,
yeah,
and I'm gonna save all of you. That
yeah.
the
There's
one.
a lot of that grandstanding, which hadn't been so much, maybe a little bit in Sylvester McCoy's era, although he tended to do it in a kind of self-deprecating way.
Yeah,
Um, but you know, when you look back at the ends of eras, even the ones, you know, there's some where they were just sort of done, like, well, Sylvester McCoy, Colin Baker into Sylvester McCoy, obviously, for wider issues. But even the more sort of emotional farewells and regenerations of earlier eras, you look at John Pertwee's last story. That's probably the most indulgent one, really, of the early era. But it's done quite well.
oh
You know,
yeah,
he stumbles out of the
with the
TARDIS.
card chase as well. Oh no,
Oh
yeah,
well, yeah. But certainly that final scene where he stumbles out of the TARDIS, falls to the ground, and says, you know what, there's life, there's, and then he just dies and
Adios,
regenerates into Tom
MJ.
Baker. Yeah, exactly. And uh, the the Peter Davison, you know, it feels different this time, and you do have that indulgence, that looking back to what's gone before. You know, his companions appear to him, but there's
Yeah,
not that kind of big grandstanding thing, because there's that sense of, you know, we're passing on, people are excited about the new incarnation and the new part. And so I think, in a way, that because that final scene is a lot of lasts with Capaldi, you know, it's Capaldi's last scene, it's Murray Gold's last score, and so you hear little motifs of his earlier songs. You hear, like, when he regenerates into her, you hear that the Doctor's theme all the way back from Rose when we first met Eccleston.
mm.
It's Moffat's last piece of writing for the show, and there's a sense similar to you know, Tennant's last one, that, you know, this is end of an era. And you should feel like that, but then it becomes a bit too self-indulgent. I think not as self-indulgent as that last Tennant story, because talk about dragging it out. But he goes to visit like everyone he's ever met.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
and I love that because it means so much to them. But for me, I think narrative-wise, it's so indulgent.
And we already had that in Journey's End as well. It wouldn't
Well,
have been so bad
exactly,
if we
yeah,
hadn't already seen that. But we'd already
yeah,
sort of seen that whole thing play out in Journey's End, Stolen Earth. So to see it again, like a couple
yeah,
episodes later, did feel a
definitely.
bit tacked on.
Mm,
Going back to what you're saying about Capaldi very briefly, I always thought the original intent of Capaldi's Doctor was to sort of be the rebel Time Lord that you don't mess with. You know, obviously in that scene in Deep Breath where he's wrestling with
yeah,
the clockwork droid, and you know, looks up at the camera and he gives you a sort of look like you don't mess with me. You know,
Yeah.
he's finally embracing his sort of rebel side.
Yeah.
I thought a great way to sort of flip that and do the opposite for the next incarnation, as Doctor Who likes to do. They like to do the opposite with the next incarnation.
Yeah.
I thought what they were going to do was make Jodie a bit more timid, a bit more hesitant, a bit more reluctant, a bit more reserved, kind of like a traditional Time Lord in a sense. And she would slowly become more confident. But it turns out it just turns out that they kind of did a more paint by numbers Doctor character to me.
I think that's the thing, isn't it? Is knowing what did they intend going into that show. You know, is the focus going to be on the fact that we've got this new incarnation of the Doctor who physically is different to before, you know, because of agenda, but also, you know, how is she going to be? But at the same time, I think there were a lot of other ideas that want to be explored that perhaps those 10 episodes didn't really give enough opportunity to really, you know, explore and to investigate, you know. So I think that's very much why I still feel, you know, I need another series or two to really define, you know, whether I like the era in comparison to previous ones. I mean, I didn't mind. I enjoyed the last series.
That's fair enough.
There were episodes and bits of them where I felt, you know, I wouldn't have done it that way, or I didn't really like that aspect of it. But I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it for what it was. But I must admit, I felt more like how I had felt when the Tennant era was on, in the fact that I watched it and I enjoyed it, but I didn't necessarily automatically want to watch it again, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Not in the same way that I absolutely loved the first season of Matt Smith's Doctor. That was more the kind, and I just thought, this is great. I really like the ideas behind it. I like the fact that the whole universe is blowing up at the end of the season, and you know, and again, there are missteps in there as well, but I enjoyed that kind of incarnation and how that was being sort of explored. I kind of, you know, it's not necessarily up there with the sort of the greats, you know, the great stories. I know loads of people absolutely loathe the Witchfinders, but I quite liked that one. I like the setting. I think it's partly because I enjoy historical stories quite a lot. I tend to like it where they go back into history.
Thing is, I'm more into the sort of, I'm kind of the adverse of you in that respect, because I'm more of a fan of the sort of the space opera kind of stories that are very grand in scale and very science fiction in their concepts. Don't get me wrong, I love my history, but I feel like some of the historical episodes have a tendency to sort of, I guess, drag is probably the best thing I could say, as whereas I feel like with a lot of more space science fiction heavy episodes, I feel like they're more
room to breathe, maybe.
More room to breathe and a bit more sort of engaging to me personally. But again, that's probably me personally.
Well, yeah, that's fair enough, and that's the thing, really, of Doctor Who, that it can morph and change and appeal to different people in different ways, and I think that's a big aspect of its longevity, really, that it's not constrained to a particular kind of story type and a particular kind of design and look and issues, and that's why. You know, I know I when there are missteps, I'm not that upset about it, because I know that Doctor Who can exist in so many different forms, and it will just change again and morph again and carry on in one way or another. You know, it might not be on the television, you know, but for me, as someone who grew up without it being on the television, Doctor Who for me has always been more than just a television program. I mean, that's its home and that's its definitive form in some way, but like many stories that have that longevity and go on, it can continue in other media. And you know, for example, the fact that Big Finish now's library is way larger than, you know, it's longer than the entirety of Doctor Who, I believe, just the monthly series. And the book, I mean, I've read 275 books, I think, Doctor Who books in my time. I mean, that is over the course of about 20 years, but you know, it's something that is, for me, beyond it's more than it's some of its parts kind of thing.
I mean, like, for me, you know, there are always, you know, like for everyone, there's going to be decisions that they don't agree with, you know. Like for me, I wasn't overtly keen on the idea of a female Doctor. You know, I would have, you know, I personally prefer the Doctor as a male character. I think just because that's, you know, how the original character was conceived. That's not to say that I wasn't, you know, open to it being good.
Yeah.
You know, I wanted it to be good. I wanted her to prove me wrong, and she hasn't just yet. I hope that she does.
Yeah.
But I'm not, I guess, convinced by what I've seen previously.
Well, I mean, I felt similar. And in fact, it's something that I've sort of had to reference a few times, because when I made my very first video, my intro video to the series, which sometimes people miss in watching through, because I had to take it down and re-upload it. So in my regular uploads list, it doesn't appear at the bottom.
But it's,
it's just a short little one, really. It's not really going into much, but I did mention at the time, because obviously the idea of a female Doctor is something that's been mooted for decades, as I've tried to sort of slyly show in different newspaper cuttings and things when I've talked about the casting of new Doctors, all the way back.
Doctor Who and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, when Peter Davison left, that was one, and it was something that John Nathan Turner, who was always very savvy to get attention and get column inches in newspapers, would always float around. In fact, that was the sort of the in-joke, if you didn't know about the Doctor's wife and why the story is called The Doctor's Wife. Because I think it goes back to a story in the 80s. There was a leak in the production office, and they didn't know who it was. So I think John Nathan Turner, he didn't write a script, but he kind of created a script that was titled The Doctor's Wife. And he wanted to see if it sort of got filtered out into the media, so he could kind of spot who the mole was, kind of thing. But that was the sort of the origin of that title. But it's something that's been mooted for a long time. Patrick Troughton was quite keen on it. He thought it would be a good idea when they asked him in the 80s and things like that. And people were always like, well, it's got to be Joanna Lumley. So this is why she was eventually cast in the Curse of the Fatal Death. I actually quite, having watched that again recently as doing videos and things like that, I think she would have been a really, really good Doctor, because she's got that kind of authority and presence.
I feel like if they'd have taken that self-aware approach with it as well, I'd have been a lot more forgiving of it. Kind of like with Missy, like she embraced it rather than with 13,
the femininity. Whereas
with like 13, it feels like she's trying to almost not reject it, but like not acknowledge it.
I think, but I think that's part of the wider ideology in a way, is that you know, it's very difficult sometimes, especially when, you know, you've got quite a lot of male writers, to try and handle issues of femininity and female identity when you're a bloke, and not end up doing something arguably that's a little bit sort of sexist or chauvinistic in some way. You know, I think when you look back at the Joanna Lumley, and she's like, look, I've got etheric beam locators, when she's talking about her breasts, and the sonic screwdriver vibrates and it's got 3 settings. I mean, they're very cheeky jokes, and I'm not one of the professionally offended. So, but they are a little bit dated by modern concept, and it does kind of reduce her status a little bit. But you know, it was a little funny sketch, so it's not like a big thing. And I'm sure they wouldn't dare try to do something like that in the modern series. But
could you imagine?
I think what might be interesting, and I don't know whether this would be, as a man myself, I don't know whether this would be an example of being just as bad, but it kind of reminded me a little bit. I don't know if you know Babylon 5, sci-fi show back in the 90s.
I know of it. I don't think I've.
Well, there's a female character in that called Delenn, who's an alien, a Minbari, and they have this kind of like a bony crest on their head. They don't have hair. Right. And in one of the seasons, she sort of uses this device and becomes sort of half human, so she gets hair, basically. And there's one little, it's almost like a little throwaway thing. It's not a big part, it's not a major plot thing or something about an episode. But there's this bit where she's just really struggling with her hair, and she has to ask a female crew member, say, like, what do you do with it? And she sort of teaches how to look after her hair, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know if perhaps there's scope in the new series to perhaps explore some of those. I mean, that's not really a gender thing, even though it's 2 women talking, but I didn't know if there was some scope within the series to perhaps, seeing as how the Doctor prior to the modern era has been so blissfully unaware of female issues or identity, you know, to perhaps, have a bit of a throwaway gag in that way. But I don't know if there's something that could be explored without risk of diminishing her character or her presence in the show.
I just think it should have been acknowledged more than just like.
I used to be a bloke 3 hours ago, kind of thing.
Yeah, 40 minutes ago I was a white-haired Scotsman, and that's all we hear of it.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah,
we're just supposed to like go along with it.
But that's why I'm quite looking forward. I'm really interested in. I don't know if you know, but Sophie Aldred has just written a novel that's coming out in the new year.
Yeah,
where Ace meets the 13th Doctor, and I think that would be really interesting, especially seeing as it's written by a woman, to see if that that's got to be explored as part of it. I really hope it is. Ace's relationship with the Doctor, very much he was a kind of like sometimes a fatherly figure, but sometimes perhaps a kind of like but very much it was very much a kind of of the time, a kind of male with this kind of representing perhaps the old patriarchal kind of dynamic with this kind of upstart teen young woman, who didn't fit into that kind of typical niche that previous companions had.
Yeah.
And I think it'll be interesting. I really hope in that book she kind of has a bit of an exploration of that. But of course, again, you've got a book, so you've got more opportunity to explore those things and still have all the monsters and the green blobby things and stuff that goes on, which perhaps you don't have so much in the series. And that's one of the reasons why I've enjoyed Doctor Who fiction as much as I have, in that it does give that extra breathing space sometimes. Not always used, but and it doesn't have to be really like gratuitous or graphic. With the New Adventures, I mentioned how in my video how sometimes they were a little bit too far, and we had sex and violence and things like that, and you don't necessarily need all those things. That doesn't make a book adult, it just makes it gratuitous. You can have something that explores things in an adult way that's still suitable for children.
Like, something I really want to read is Scratch Man, the Tom.
I haven't read that yet, but I'd be really interested to look at that.
I remember them mentioning one scene where it's like all the previous Doctor's past incarnations are like hanging like scarecrows, mocking him and stuff. And
it's a great idea, isn't it?
What an amazing way to explore the mortality of the Doctor in a way that we haven't seen before. You know, how all those different personas interact with each other within the Doctor's own head. Think Inside Out meets Doctor Who. Like, I think that would be,
There is some of that in the New Adventures sometimes. I can't remember the specific book now, but there was one where the Seventh Doctor is kind of having an argument with the Sixth Doctor, and how the Sixth Doctor, because they built up a kind of like a suggested story there that it's since been obviously superseded by Big Finish and other continuity, but the idea was that the Seventh Doctor engineers the Sixth Doctor's regeneration into him, that this idea that there was this thing that he was needed for, that the seventh incarnation was needed, and how the Sixth Doctor needed to be got out of the way, kind of thing, in order to allow the Seventh Doctor to face, be Time's champion and face. And so there are moments in a book where he sort of is in a kind of a dreamscape or a mindscape, and he has arguments with the Sixth Doctor. And that's really clever, these kinds of things that you can't really do in the show, not because you couldn't achieve it visually necessarily, but because I think of the different kind of needs, the different things that the show need, the different directions that the show is pulled in from a production point of view, from the BBC point of view, from the whole marketability and the audience demographics and all that kind of corporate things, which stops it from being able to do that, along with the format. The 45-minute episode format is not something that can always, when you're trying to make something that 10-year-olds will be able to sit in front of and enjoy, as well as 50-year-olds, you can't always do all that and please all those audiences, especially if you're trying to explore something a bit more cerebral, perhaps.
Yeah. So my question, I'd like to ask you a question. If you could put two Doctors into a multi-Doctor story, which two would you choose?
Oh God. Well, I mean, the great desire, of course, would be to match up a modern Doctor with a classic era Doctor, perhaps, because that can't physically be realised. I mean, obviously they did a bit in Twice Upon a Time, but as you say, arguably not quite the real character of the First Doctor. But I don't know. It's
not to discredit David Bradley's performance, though. He did a fantastic job. It was more again the writing that I think.
Well, one of the things that I have a little bit, and this isn't as you say, like David Bradley, it's not really fair, and it can't really be helped. But David Bradley is a lot older than William Hartnell was when he played the Doctor. A lot of people forget and don't realise, because William Hartnell had a kind of an old face, that he was actually the same and a wig. Yeah, indeed, he was the same age essentially as Peter Capaldi, and therefore there's an energy and a vitality which is kind of lost whenever they've like when Richard Hurndall played him in the Five Doctors and David Bradley played him.
So when did he did
he's a much older man. Exactly, yeah. And to be fair, William Hartnell's Doctor, he was playing an older man. This was before, we knew he was hundreds of years old. He was supposed to be an older man, but still, he, when you see him fighting in the Romans and wrestling people, throwing people out windows, and sword fighting with his cane with his robot double in the chase, there's those elements I think tend to be forgotten about. Anyway, God, I don't know. Two Doctors to come together. I don't know really. I think it would definitely be interesting to have the First Doctor as William Hartnell, as he was, meet perhaps and have an adventure perhaps with a later incarnation. Maybe someone like Tennant, to really have that contrast. I don't know. Although you kind of got that a little bit with John Hurt, kind of being a kind of personification of classic era Doctor attitude, expressing his disapproval at how these older incarnations of himself were acting like children, with their catchphrases and the way they hold their sonic screwdrivers and everything. I don't know. That's a really, really difficult question. I think any unusual combination, I think, is something that intrigues me. Having, like, say, Patrick Troughton meet Matt Smith or Colin Baker or someone like that, I think would something that would sort of tickle my fancy. But I think really it comes down to the threat that they face. I think a lot of the time in multi-Doctor stories, because they tend to be celebratory, the focus is on the Doctor and their interaction with each other, and so the enemy or the villain becomes a bit of a MacGuffin. I mean, that's certainly true in Day of the Doctor, where the Zygons are kind of like a side story that isn't really resolved, and then the Time War is seen but not really delved into as such, because the focus is all on the Doctors. So I don't know. I think they become something that's defined against the enemies that they face, perhaps.
There's quite a few combinations I'd like to see. I think 9 and 12 I'd like to see together. I think that would be a cool dynamic.
I think it would be good, because they'd kind of both be trying to puncture each other's pomposity and superiority. I think 3, 9 and 12, because they're all kind of grumpy and authoritarian and sure that they're right, but of course they would all criticize each other.
I'd also like to see, I think, 8 and 10 as well. 8 and 10 would be a cool dynamic, because I think 8 sets up a lot of the things that 10 would go on to do. The whole kissing thing. And by the way, my head canon for him kissing, because I remember you mentioning in a video that, a lot of people were sort of outraged by the kiss. My head canon for it is more that he's partaking in the traditions of, New Year's for humans, obviously, sort of.
I see, like a kiss under the mistletoe type thing.
Kind of like that. It's not really
because the first kiss, I never had a problem with the first kiss and that idea of him kissing her, because he's exuberant. It's that later one which is, as I say, arguably more romantic. But I'd never really thought about that. Because you've got them singing Lang Syne in the background and everything.
I'd say it's more traditional than him being romantic. I mean, that's my sort of headcanon. I know they intended for him to be romantic because they wanted to appeal to as wide a demographic as possible. So obviously but
we can make, that's the great thing about Doctor Who, is that you can make new continuities and rationalize things, like the Peter Cushing films, how you incorporate, maybe they were based on his adventures. And I've heard elsewhere someone suggest, I'm not sure how logically this works out, that actually he's the Doctor who's used the chameleon arch and made himself human, although it doesn't explain why he's randomly got Ian and Barbara, and Barbara is his
and a
daughter and
TARDIS
things, but still.
and a
Yeah,
TARDIS that is a
yeah.
TARDIS, but also not a TARDIS at the same.
Yeah. But there's, you can have a lot of joy and pleasure. I mean, that was one of the things that, tying things up and trying to rationalize them. I heard an interesting one as well, the fact that the Doctor doesn't get his Time Lord physiology until after his first regeneration, because William Hartnell, there's several times where people say he's got a heart, not two hearts, and things like that, and that he doesn't actually do anything particularly inhuman as such, or have any kind of extra abilities or powers until the latter half of Patrick Troughton's era. You get a sense that he doesn't need to breathe as much oxygen as others, and stuff. So I don't particularly like that idea, but it's a great little possibilities and ideas that you can come up with and throw them in. That's one of the joys, really, of being a fan of something like that.
I mean, I always thought it'd be an excellent idea to have a story in which the Doctor's Time Lord essence essentially is removed. Think the sort of the Earthbound sort of era with John Pertwee, but on steroids. So if the Doctor dies, that's it. There's no big regeneration at the end. That's just it. And maybe he will.
Well, that's the thing. Sometimes regeneration, because obviously the Doctor always regenerates. Early on or earlier on, and even referenced sometimes, it's suggested and implied that this is something that won't automatically happen. I mean, very much the original
as well.
He's not. I don't know if I will regenerate. And originally, the implication is that it's actually something to do with the TARDIS. That the TARDIS was something that rejuvenates him. And that was also the thing as well. The idea was that originally, although it quickly changed when they cast him, I think the rationale was that Patrick Troughton was going to be play a younger version of the first Doctor, that he wasn't turning into a new body, but rather being de-aged by the TARDIS, which is why randomly, and they've never really satisfactorily explained this, but the first Doctor's clothes regenerate with him into Patrick Troughton's clothes. He doesn't choose them like you get the traditional thing of choosing clothes from a locker or something.
Do you know, I completely forgot about that.
Yeah. It's something that it's kind of, just kind of go blah, blah, blah.
But he did he not still have First Doctor's ring on his hand? Or
he did have the ring, and that falls off when he stands up. So of course the suggestion is, of course, that his physiology has changed, but I think the initial idea was to do that because originally the idea was in the Celestial Toymaker, when the Celestial Toymaker makes the Doctor go invisible. The idea was when they made him visible again, he'd be a new actor, because they basically wanted to get rid of William Hartnell sooner. And the producer sort of looked into it, but in the end they changed their mind, but the script had already been written, so he still goes invisible and then reappears at the end as William Hartnell. But that was how the original one had gone. And I just think, what if they'd done that? Because if they had established some sort of thing that when they then got to the end of the second Doctor's era, or the young first Doctor's era, how would they have then made the show continue? Now, there's so many points where the show could have ended. Or
I remember you mentioning because in your retrospective you talk about the end of each era and how they all thought that it was going to die. Basically, they all thought that was it with each passing incarnation. Obviously, with the end of Hartnell, how do you replace the Doctor at the time, the only Doctor?
And at the end of Patrick Troughton's era was going to be cancelled as well, and so that John Pertwee start is very much a reboot of the show and a trial of can this show continue.
The end of John Pertwee as well. He'd become so iconic, so popular that it was a huge gamble when they cast Tom Baker. You could basically say that for every time that they.
The funny thing was that he was actually the youngest actor to have been cast as the Doctor at the time as well, Tom Baker. He was seen as this young, virile actor, and of course he was. But compare that to a 29-year-old.
Yeah, no. I just think it's such an interesting topic, just Doctor Who in general. Like, we've basically just sort of done a crash course in, like, everything Doctor Who related.
that's the thing, is it? It's such a big thing that it isn't just the, the 7 or 8 seasons or something that you do. There's a whole culture and there's a whole milieu of things that can be explored and discussed and iterations. And there used to be a website when I was at college. I used to go on this website, and I think it was called what was it called? It had the name. It doesn't exist anymore, so it's not really relevant. But it was basically a repository of all fan fiction for Doctor Who, and there were literally thousands and thousands of stories, and there were some really, really excellent stories about future incarnations of the Doctor. I remember reading it and go, oh my God, this one's got the 11th Doctor in, we'll never have that. And, it's just such a big thing. It's such a big cultural thing that is, this tapestry, really, that's woven by different people, not just by the creators, but by the fans. We input into it. And that's why I think we have a responsibility not to take it for granted somewhat as well.
That's kind of why I don't set too many specific top points of discussion for when I do these, because obviously I knew with yours in particular that the entire MO of your channel is to basically a retrospective of the show. So that's why I wanted to talk about, obviously with the recent Paul McGann video, I wanted to talk about the Wilderness years, because that's something I found extremely interesting in your retrospective. Same things for like Classic Who, and obviously it was interesting hearing some of your thoughts on Modern Who, because you haven't got to them yet. And and I think
I expect some controversies when I do.
I think it will be very interesting when you do, though, particularly with the later, obviously with 12, with 13. I think it will be interesting to see. Obviously, we know sort of how Capaldi's era went, but I think it will be interesting to sort of look back on Whittaker's era to a degree. I think it will be one of those eras that will be an interesting period for the show, just because of how, I suppose, divisive it kind of is to a degree.
I think it would be similar in a way to talking not because of the same thing, or the same issues, but it would be similar to talking about the kind of the latter sort of Colin Baker era kind of thing. I don't mean to say that it is comparable in the sense of its narrative or its decisions, but in the sense of it's something that still has that, the book isn't closed on that still today, and there are discussions and debates about that. Unlike, say, the kind of received wisdom of, say, the Hinchcliffe era generally is considered by most people to be outstanding. There's not much debate over that kind of thing. I think that's the important thing. Is what does upset me to some extent is where people, especially about things that are coming out now, kind of posit ideas and theories, and it's kind of like, this is the final word, this is set in stone kind of thing. And I like to take a bit of a longer view of things, and I also like to wait a little bit of time before attempting in a way to present my thoughts, because I think I need them to settle a little bit more first before I go back.
My final question I posed to you before we wrap this up is, in your, I believe it's your 6th Doctor, it's early in the 7th Doctor retrospective, when you talk about the 6th Doctor being booted off the show. And you say, I won't deign to air all that dirty laundry here, or something to that effect.
Yes, that's true.
What do you honestly think happened? Because it is something that I always wonder what did happen with the Colin Baker's Doctor. What was the, I guess, obviously we kind of know the reasoning. It's because Michael Gray obviously didn't like him, and he was basically forced out by the higher ups. But I feel
I think there's a lot. I mean, partly why I said I won't deign to all that dirty laundry is because I didn't want to try and state anything as definitive, because it is still quite unknown, and as subject to a lot of gossip.
For more like your personal opinion on what happened.
Right. Well, I mean, there's lots of alleged things. I mean, I heard one theory about how Michael Grade was very close to Colin Baker's ex-wife, and how he hated him on a personal level in that way. I don't know how much to put in that. I don't think it's so simple as that. I think that it was part of the general attitude of people like Michael Grade and Jonathan Powell at the BBC that they really did not like Doctor Who, and more so than that, they didn't like people who liked Doctor Who. They didn't think they were valid viewers. Well, part of that, but he was the incumbent at the time, and so it was. I think part of it was a bluff that was called by JNT in that he said, "Okay, I think that because the fact was no one wanted to take over. No one would. If JNT had quit, the show would have been cancelled." And so although he gets a lot of stick for staying as long as he did. I think, I mean, it lasted as long as it did, and we got those, in my opinion, really excellent last 2 seasons with Sylvester McCoy as a result of his resilience and his commitment. And in fact, he kind of really ruined his career by doing so, because he didn't really have much authority afterwards. He wanted to go earlier than that and had made plans to do so, but he knew that if he did, the show would probably would have given the excuse. And I think part of it was fire Colin Baker, as a way of trying to get him to say, well, I'm not going to do that, I quit. And they'll go, right, well, we cancel the show. And I think JNT, for good or ill, called their bluff and said, okay, I'll fire him. And then they had to kind of say, all right, continue. And they were just waiting with bated breath for the excuse. And the funny thing is, we talk a lot about ratings, and I mention ratings quite a lot in my videos as some sort of measure of its popularity. But actually, the BBC for a very long time, they don't really have to care about ratings, because they
merchandise that they've really got to worry about and things like that.
Well, I think part of that for their corporate interest, but I mean their license fee will be paid whatever, but
no matter what.
And the money that is made from merchandising goes back into the BBC as a whole. So if loads of Daleks get sold, that doesn't mean that the show gets more money. It just means the BBC gets more money as a whole and can put it into other things. So ratings have never really been something that they fervently look at in the same way that, say, commercial networks do, because the advertisers want to have as many bums on seats when they show their adverts. I mean, I remember when I was at university and I studied film and television, a guy once explaining it in a way that really opened my eyes. He said, he was talking about commercial television. He was saying our job is to make programs that fill the gap between ad breaks. And I thought that was such an interesting perspective, a horrific perspective, but nevertheless an interesting one in that, that's what they're there for, to get you to watch the adverts. Because the BBC has a different motivation than that, they don't have to look at ratings in that way. But
I do think they are a good measure.
It can be a good excuse to. Yeah, well, I mean, they will look at them and they will consider them, because, they want to be making programs that people want to watch. If not, people will rightly say, well, why am I paying for this? Especially if it's an expensive program, an expensive drama. But at the same time, they don't have to. So they were looking fervently, Jonathan Powell, and as soon as Doctor Who dropped below what was considered a reasonable audience size at the time, with Battlefield, I think it dropped down to 3 million views. They went, right, that's it, axe. And the axe falls. But they did it in a way which was like, well, it might come back, or we might sell it to a private company to make. And I don't think they really, certainly the people at the top, like Jonathan Powell, had any intention of doing that. They couldn't care less.
It was really it was really just sort of empty words.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a way to placate people so that they didn't, organise any kind of more movement like had happened prior. But also, it had
the day
lots
of action that you mentioned.
Yeah.
It's quite
funny.
That
didn't really make much of an impact.
I find that quite funny looking back on it, really, because I think it just shows how much more of a voice we have now as opposed to back then. Because whether we like it or not, the BBC are watching what we put out to a degree. They have to review things for things like copyright and things like that, so they are seeing what we're saying. Yeah. They're not completely oblivious as some people make out.
No, and I think more and more that idea of the audience voice is being heard, sometimes to the detriment of shows. I think sometimes the response go, well, the fans say this, so I'll do this, or I'll put this in, can then lead to another thing. But sometimes it can actually be the lifeblood of the show. I mean, I'm not a fan of Supernatural. My wife enjoys it. But I mean, that's been going now for like 17 series or something ridiculous. And I think that that's very much come down to the fact that it has this core audience who will watch it, and I think they listen to what those people say, and it influences the show. But sometimes it can go too far. Like, I think probably the best example of that is Snakes on a Plane, which is essentially a film made by an internet committee of people. Sometimes you've got to give people what they want, but you've got to balance it with what is good in the larger sense and for the general audience as well. If not, you do become a kind of self-referential continuity fest that doesn't really have
Moffat kind of became towards the end.
I think he did, yeah. And the last season of his and Capaldi, I think, was a bit more refreshing. I mean, certainly, my wife is a fan of science fiction and Doctor Who, nowhere near to the extent I am.
Yeah,
obviously, I don't
think in your
very many
video when you were putting classic Doctor Who episodes, she'd roll her eyes and things.
Yeah, well, it's not that she doesn't value it or she doesn't see it as worthwhile. It's just that she doesn't like classic television. She likes modern things. She likes their kind of elements, and she does enjoy some classic Doctor Who, but she has watched the new series of Doctor Who since it's been on, and that was one of the things that we sort of bonded over when we first met each other, was the Tennant era of Doctor Who, which was her favourite. Her favourite era is probably the Matt Smith era, I'd say now. But she at the same time felt, I think she'd agree with you really in the fact that she felt that, it became too much about Clara, it became too self-referential, and she really enjoyed that season with Bill, and the different dynamic and how it gave Doctor an opportunity to be kind of on his own, really, be his own thing, rather than. I personally, I don't mind Clara too much. I do take upon the concerns that other people have. I think, though, that she should have left when she was intended to leave, which is in the final story of that first season in Deep Water, is it? Dark Water, or whatever it is.
I would have even preferred it if it was in
or even in the Christmas one.
Or Face the Raven.
Face the Raven, yeah. But you've got to, I think, in a way, it's almost like a running joke that no one ever really dies in a Stephen Moffat story. I mean, his first few stories, literally no one dies.
No, true. I think it did become too self-referential, and I think that is, cause, take for example the Paradigm. No one liked the Paradigm. What does Moffat do? He backpedals, goes straight back to the Time War ones. We continue to have the Time War ones up to now, because obviously we've seen. I don't know whether you've seen the images, but they are in series 12. So.
Oh, they are. No, I haven't seen that. Okay. Well, I mean, they kind of almost. No, it's fine. They kind of retconned it a little bit in Asylum of the Daleks, in sort of making it almost like they'd become like the leaders, and that the bronzy gold Daleks were kind of like the regular drones. I kind of like the idea behind them, because I think the rationale was to kind of return it to the original Ray Cusick sketches, where they were taller and more cylindrical and had an eye that could be seen, that was more on a flexible rod kind of thing. But I think really the big problem, is the hunchback. Although the idea behind that, of course, was that the which was never realised, which they really should have done, just that it could like rotate out and go to the front. But also it was the colour scheme. And the fact that they were the sort of united colours of Dalek kind of coming out and had these different roles, apparently. I didn't mind when I played the adventure games. I think it was the first one that the BBC did. There was one story where you went to a kind of devastated alternate Earth, and there were the red Daleks driving about, and it kind of made me think, this could kind of work.
Yeah, they were.
But I think
they were the drone ones.
Changed that silhouette, didn't they? They changed the silhouette of the Dalek too drastically, and you can't do that. It's like Batman or even the Doctor's clothing. In a way, it works best when there's that kind of linear. You can see the progression, a kind of a silhouette, and you can know who that character is. And the Dalek with the hunchback is just too odd, really. But I think I think one of the things they said was that in person they looked better, and having seen them at the Doctor Who experience, I kind of get that they are more, because they're so tall and intimidating over, say, one of the things that I noticed when I first saw an actual full-size Dalek, and this is a classic series Dalek, was how short they are, because I'm quite tall, I'm 6'2", so I'm always amazed when I see things from films or even actors and go, oh my God, you're so small. Like Sophie Aldred is tiny. Yeah. She's so small. I met her and I was 16 and I was towering over her. But, you know, on film, you don't get that impression. People look bigger, or big things look smaller, you know, and so they don't have that presence on the screen, I think. And that was something I think they realised even before the backlash when they saw it, you know, maybe when they were editing it together, and thought, actually, they don't look half as good when they're actually filmed, you know.
Yeah, but I feel like the backpedaling, I think to a degree, kind of was a mistake. I understand why it was done, but at the same time I feel like I'm kind of sick of the Time War Daleks now, and I feel like looking back
have the courage of your convictions kind of thing, really.
Yeah, and I think looking back on it, that's one mistake that I feel like we've got to account for, because as fans we made that decision. We said, no, we don't like this, change it back, you know, and it was like, they listened, but I think that was one of the bad examples of them listening. Now, personally, I would have preferred it if they'd have carried on and we'd have seen different Daleks, because, you know, seeing the same bronze ones can sometimes take the impact out of seeing a Dalek when it looks exactly the same as it has for like the past, I don't know, more than a decade now, almost like going on for sort of 15 years, you know, sort of thing.
Well, I think that's the thing, isn't it? Again, it's about balance, isn't it? It's about what criticism do you take, what criticism you listen to, and what not. And I think that's the problem sometimes with internet criticism, is it can become so vociferous and it can become so vitriolic and not very fair.
Like
that the temptation, I understand it perfectly, is just to switch off from that and not listen at all.
I think a good example is Love and Monsters. Like the internet response to that is like, for the longest time, was very negative. You know, everyone hated it, and I can understand why. But knowing William Grantham, the guy who created the Absorbaloff, myself, you know, he actually thinks it's decent, and more people are starting to look at it and say, was it really as bad as we made it out?
I don't have a problem actually with the Absorb, but the Love and Monsters is one of the stories. I really do not like Love and Monsters. I never did, even the day it went out, and my wife agrees as well, and she tends to like the kind of the humour of the thing. However, though, I actually quite like the Absorbaloff, and I quite like Peter Kay in that story. And my wife absolutely hates it, but I quite like it. That's not generally my problem with that story. And I kind of think I should like it more, because I think, you know, there's a lot of in-jokes and references, and the idea of being a fan, that's the sort of the subtext. And the fact that Peter Kay's character is essentially a caricature of a guy who was kind of the super fan who became ingrained in the show, who involved himself in Levine in the 80s, and then sort of trying to dictate how you could and couldn't be a fan and stuff. And I think I should appreciate that more, but I just don't know. I just think that, you know, it was worth doing, I suppose. But when I might re-evaluate it when I come to my David Tennant episode. But
I think that would be a good one to reevaluate. Kind of like how you talk about Dimensions in Time. I think Love and Monsters would sort of fill that similar void. A story that's kind of infamous within the community. So I think that would be an interesting one to talk about, as well as obviously your favourites of each era that you sort of talk about in each retrospective.
Well, I try to be fair. A lot of people appreciate my considered sort of arguments about things, because I try not to be too sycophantic, while at the same time I think sometimes there's a bit of a fad or a fashion. It gets more views perhaps if people are more vociferously negative about things, and I try never to forget why I enjoy the show in the way that I talk about the stories. And I mean, even Dimensions in Time, you know, it's horrendous, but at the same time, I was keen. Yeah, I was keen to point out that the motivation for making it and the result of it was raising money for those children, and a lot of people benefited from that travesty. And actually, that fits more with the ideology of the Doctor than perhaps some of the other side projects have been. So there's always two sides to everything. I think.
It's actually quite interesting because for my 1 year anniversary, that's going to be on the 1st of December, 1 year on YouTube. I'm going to be doing a review of Dimensions in Time with basically past me.
Right.
So it's kind of my Day of the Doctor equivalent.
Okay. So what, you're going to be like a past incarnation of yourself, sort of talking about that? Well, that's quite clever.
I'm going to be using like the original recording methods, what I used then to record his lines, until future me basically says, your audio sounds terrible. Here, you can share my microphone. Because going back to my earlier videos, it is kind of, it keeps me humble. Let's just say that, because whereas now I've sort of I know how to edit and how to record voiceover. Back then I didn't know how to do that. I literally just recorded my phone screen. And my phone microphone was the microphone that I used. There wasn't any special microphone that I had, unlike now, because it was literally just something on a whim one day I decided to do. But
I think that's something that an audience enjoys as well on YouTube, is that people do tend to enjoy how the channel evolves and the technology that people use and how they can do it. And I think that, I came to making my channel with perhaps a little bit more experience than some others, but there's with the level of effort that I put into it and the possibilities, and the more, because I know there's an audience there now to watch it, perhaps I am a little bit more measured about what I do and what I choose to do in the videos. But so there's still some progression there, and I think that's part of what someone enjoys, because some people, no one has said this, but sometimes I've thought, as a rebuttal to my point about how I wanted to make something that was perhaps a little bit more, like you very kindly said, that you would expect more of a professional company to make. But at the same time, I've thought, well, it's called YouTube for a reason, and perhaps the reason for YouTube to exist is because it is about people sharing in a kind of guerrilla fashion what their thoughts and ideas are. It's not necessarily somewhere people come for a polished production, maybe.
Well, I think you kind of strike that balance very well, though, because you have personal anecdotes within your documentaries. Obviously, in the first William Hartnell episode, as I said, you've got the whole story of your mum goes to
my mum,
and sitting down and watching it for the first time, which is absolutely lovely. I'm obviously I'm one of those, like, my parents sort of passingly watched it, but it was not something that like they actively watched. My dad was in his youth he was a lot more sporty. And, I don't think my mum was very into television, so I don't really know where I got the sort of media aspect of my personality from. But I suppose it's lovely to see those sort of family stories that you have, and I think it does add a sense of, I suppose, uniqueness and personality to the videos that I would say just a regular BBC production wouldn't have, because you basically just got this disembodied voice that just talks history about the show, which in its own way is great, but I also think having the little personal touches makes it part of YouTube and part of this culture where people see people who are like themselves and could be them,
I suppose you're right. And I think that's the thing, is that I titled my show Doctor Who Review and Analysis, but it is more of a guide to the show and a bit of an autobiographical kind of explanation, really, of it. So, I suppose that's the niche, really, of what it is.
Yeah, and I think, as I said, I think you tread that line expertly, in my opinion. But that's just...
Thank you very much.
But But I think we're going to leave it there because
Yeah.
I think we've been going for 2.5
A
hours.
very long time,
Very
yeah.
long
Well, it's
time.
lovely to speak to you.
It's been absolutely lovely to speak to you. I always loved getting people on. You know, I never expected as many people to say yes as they actually have. You know,
Well, it's like you say, it's a great thing to be able to chat about a mutual interest, and
Yes.
you know, and to talk in that way, you know.
But I think one thing I've learned is that if you ask politely enough, pretty much anyone will do anything within reason.
Yeah.
You know, if you're nice enough about it, because you know, I still get this sort of feeling when I talk to the bigger creators, such as yourself, where it's kind of like, kind of looking up in sort of awe, in sort of awe sort of thing.
Well, I don't know about that. I think it's something that simultaneously. I mean, the thing about YouTube is that I suppose it depends really on how much of a community you actively try and build as such. I mean, I respond to a lot of comments that I get. I read all the comments that I ever get.
As well. Yeah.
And it does become difficult at times, and some of them are kind of like, right, where you come from? But you have interesting discussions. But at the same time, it is quite a solitary pursuit in a way, and so I think that I would hope that a lot of people who are making YouTube for the point of making videos rather than trying to get, you know, be relevant or whatever some horrible phrase might be, they would, I hope, be relatively humble, because they know, you know, they're just people making videos. You know, there's not a big production company behind them. There's not a sense of celebrity as such. So, you know, I'm more than happy to talk to anyone, whether they've got 1 million or 1 subscriber, because it is about that. I mean, ironically, being someone who has never been a real social animal in my past, I think that this is a great opportunity really to talk and to discuss with people what their thoughts are on my favorite sort of program. I don't see myself as some arbiter, some font of knowledge, and I hold the secret scrolls of Rassilon or something. You know, it's just my perspective on the show and my views and my thoughts, and I'm more than happy to discuss and listen to other people about theirs. You do get, you know, the more subscribers you get people who are out there, you know, trolls that are out there to try and attack you. It's knowing when to listen to them and when not to listen to them. Some people, you know, some of my and you know, their comments will always stand out far more than the 100 other comments that are very nice and positive. For some reason, we as humans, as critical,
we kind of gravitate towards
people.
Negativity.
Because I think generally, unless you're really arrogant and full of yourself on a lower level, you do tend to be negative about yourself, and you seek out those things that confirm that kind of unhealthy bias against yourself. But there have been times where someone has come on and commented, and they may have done it in quite an aggressive fashion, taking view with something I've said, and then I've talked to them, and then they've said, you know, actually, I appreciate the way you've talked to me, and I'm going to have another look. And those are moments of great.
And I love those people who can actually, like, maybe not agree with you, but can understand where you're coming from and be respectful about it. Those are the best people to me. Is the people who might not necessarily agree with everything you say, but can understand why you think that way. And I will say, obviously, my name sort of came from speaking my mind about Series 11 and the current sort of period of Doctor Who. I tell you, you say pretty much anything negative about Jodie Whittaker or Chris Chibnall currently, it's pretty much a guaranteed way of getting hate comments. So, but it'll eventually.
Yeah, well, they see that's the problem. Is that people on both sides of the argument can be vociferous.
Yeah.
And the problem that I have with that is that it then it creates this kind of opposition. Which I'm not a part of. You know, I might agree more with one side than the other, but the way in which you're going about it kind of brings down the, you know, the name really. You know, if people see me as pro Jodie Whittaker or whatever, then I get called a cuck and all this, and I just think, well, you're just a very sad, pathetic person. You need to chill out. And likewise, if someone is going to come and put forward a legitimate argument, which isn't window dressing to disguise their rather apparent bigotry, you know, that they don't like it, then fine. Because it's about a debate. It's not a character assassination, and it's not an ad hominem attack. I
was just gonna say it's like with me and you. Obviously, I think you liked it quite a bit more than I did. But we're not sitting here berating each other over it because it's just not the mature thing to do.
No, and I think also it's the fact that having been brought up by a man who didn't take trivia particularly seriously, my dad, I have a bit of a perspective which I think sometimes people lack, which is, although I love this thing and it is so important to me, Doctor Who is such a massive part of my life and always has been and will continue to be, I never forget that at the end of the day, it is a television program. Yeah. And there are things which I reserve my energy for that I feel are more important. And I think Doctor Who is part of that, but it's more important to direct my energy towards, being a teacher and working with young people. I come up against conflict frequently, and it's knowing which fights to have, which battles that you can win, or which are not so necessarily worth it. Because if someone is so full of hatred that they want to express that hatred, the symptom of that hatred might be the words that they speak, but the actual cause of the hatred is something I can't necessarily help with. So it's knowing which battles to fight and which arguments are legitimate and which are more symptomatic of a wider issue.
Yeah, and I think you, judging by your documentaries as well, I think you would certainly be a great educator just by how, I think, interesting you make the topics that you talk about sound.
I'm not sure all the students I taught would agree with you, but yes.
Probably not, but in my opinion, you would be, I think.
I think an important thing is that if you're not enthusiastic about the topic, or you don't come across as enthusiastic about the topic, why the hell should anyone else,
Yeah, no, I agree. But listen, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on. I'm sure this won't be the last time that we end up talking to each other. I'm sure, because obviously I'll probably be commenting on your next few reviews and analysis.
Yeah, my other one has been delayed a little bit. Just so you know,
okay.
My dad was quite seriously unwell recently. He's okay now. He's on the mend. It's kind of delayed a little bit my work on the Christopher Eccleston one. I don't want, I try not to rush, although I do feel a definite obligation to create things. But I know when I'm not in the right frame of mind, I'm not going to produce the quality that people subscribe for. So, I am working on that one though. I've got some interesting bits at the start that I want to explore. We were mentioning earlier about the attitude towards Doctor Who that Jonathan Powell and I've forgotten his name because I hate him so much. Michael Gray, there we go. And there's an interesting little clip of him talking about Doctor Who after the fact, but before the show ended, that I'm going to explore at the beginning of the video. So that's something that cool. I hope people will enjoy. I always try and make the opening of the video a little hook to that's sort of interesting. Yeah. And
your Eighth Doctor one's a good example of that, I think, where you sort of mimic the opening lines of the movie.
Yeah, when I came to do that, I was thinking, how am I going to open this one? And then I thought, well, why don't I just do a sort of redo of the voiceover from the beginning, leading into the credits, kind of thing. Yeah.
But yeah, I thought that was a very clever way of handling it, and it's not released on my channel because it got copyrighted. But I even sort of kind of took that idea and kind of because I wanted to do something for 1,000 subscribers, so I basically took the McGann intro and recorded my own voice over of it in a similar fashion, but it was kind of making fun of both, like sort of like both sides of the argument when it comes to Series 11. I think it was something like it was on the planet. I can't remember. It was on the planet, not my Doctor, that Chris Chibnall was finally being put on trial, and it was asked that I, Tharries, a rival Doctor Who nerd, take his remains back to Sheffield. It was something like that. To be honest, I'm quite gutted that it was never released because I found it quite funny. But
well, what did you appeal the copyright?
Yeah, and they wouldn't let me even show it. I might re-upload it in the future.
Because every time I upload a video, I get about 15 or 16 claims by the content ID.
Yeah.
And then I appeal it and say, this is for the purposes of review, blah, blah, blah. And what they then do when they review it is they allow it to be seen, but it can't be monetized. So it surprises me that they haven't done the same with yours, because parody, of course, is an element of that.
Yeah, I mean, I might be able to appeal it and sort of maybe like re-upload it, and maybe as part of the celebrations for 1,000, I might upload it as a sort of, not 1,000, 1 year anniversary.
The anniversary, yeah.
Maybe
yeah, you
I'll
should
upload it for that.
have another go.
Try again. But yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on. It feels like I've said that like 4 times, but it's just 'cause you keep getting sidetracked.
Yeah, sorry, I'm an expert waffler. So
as these conversations tend to go, like with like most people I have on, they end up going for hours just because of how much there is to talk about, and the opposing viewpoints that guests often present, which are thoroughly interesting to explore. But obviously I will have a link to Clever Dick Films' channel in the description, so be sure to click that button if you haven't already. I'm not very good at calls to action, if you couldn't already tell. Everyone, if you could like, comment, and subscribe, that would be fantastic if you enjoyed the content of this podcast. I feel like I haven't recorded one of these in a while, but it's certainly been great. Is there anything you'd like to promote or say before? Is there a sort of, obviously we know that the next in the review series is in the pipeline.
Yeah.
Do we have a sort of general release window for that?
Well, not quite at the moment. I'm hoping to get it done definitely by the end of the year. And hopefully much before, but I don't tend to like to, really pin down a date, because then I'll probably miss it. I've recently taken on a bit more responsibility at work as well, coordinating literacy in the school and things. So cool. It's affected a little bit, but I will definitely get on. I am getting on with that as we speak, but I'll continue and try and get that done. My other sort of project going forward is something I've been wanting to do for a long time, and I'm going to give. I created a little Patreon page in the summer to allow people who had really been campaigning several times to try and give me money, and I thought, well, if they want to, then fair enough. But I also want to give them a little bit more ownership, a little bit more input. So for a while now, I've wanted to explore some things which I haven't, for one reason or another, had the time or whatever in the big era videos, such as the companions, and do individual videos on each companion going back. But I don't necessarily want to do those in order. I want to do them based on what people want to see. So I think I'll do the first one on Susan, and there'll be shorter videos, sort of like appendix videos, and talk about Carol Ann Ford and things, a bit like I do when I talk about the character of the Doctor and the actor who plays them. But then I want to give people an opportunity if they want to see, a different companion. And I'm also working on this might take quite a while, but I recently recreated the Brahatsky TARDIS interior, the William Hartnell TARDIS in 3D. That the whole interior as it appears in Unearthly Child, and
I remember actually seeing on your Facebook page you recreated that one scene from the end of Unearthly Child, the forest that the Doctor lands in.
Oh yes, that's right. Yes. I that's one of my favourite shots of all time. So yeah, I was fiddling to try and do a sort of a CG recreation in sort of widescreen of what would that look like.
Yeah, well done to you. I really can't do CG at all.
Well, I had this software for a while now, and I've never really sort of done it. And I've sort of thought, well, I want to do a video. For a while now, I've wanted to do a video on the TARDIS, but also on the history of police boxes a little bit, and build that in so that.
I'd love that.
Because I think it's something now that the image of a TARDIS is completely synonymous with Doctor Who, but there's also a wider social historical context of what were police boxes and why were they there. But also I want some about the history of the production of the show and the concept behind the TARDIS and what the different controls do on the console, although there's not really a definitive thing on that. So I created the console room and the exterior of that TARDIS. So I'm going to render some videos, but they take an incredible. I mean, there's so much detail in that console room that one frame takes about an hour and a half to render. So obviously a video of 25 frames per second is going to take an incredible amount of time, plus with lighting and movement and all that. But I've done some tests, and I've also made an original Dalek as well that I might use in a video. So cool. I've got all these sort of little projects going on, really, but I want to put all that aside and really focus on getting this Eccleston story done. I just read Christopher Eccleston's it's not really an autobiography, it's more of a memoir.
I'm on that. That's on my list as well to get.
It's wonderful. It's very moving. Yeah, definitely recommend it. And it's not much about Doctor Who, but it gives you a lot of insight into him as a person, and some sort of, I think, probably as definitive as we're going to get, really, about what exactly went on behind the scenes. It's only really a couple of sentences. Yeah. But you putting two and two together and things, because I really wanted to try and get to the bottom of that to really talk about it in my video. Because unlike the Colin Baker firing, if you will, I think it is quite pertinent to the series and how it developed and how then series 2 came about and the character developed
very early on during series 1 that he was
on. Yeah, it would have been so much better if it had come as a complete surprise, but I think someone leaked it.
Oh, that's just the media. They'll always find a way of leaking
absolutely.
Things. But yeah, thank you again. Be sure to I'll be sure to, I'll be checking out all that stuff because that sounds right up my street.
I hope you enjoy.
But yeah, again, guys, if you enjoyed this, please like, comment, and subscribe if you want to. Please go check out Clever Dick Films. I would highly suggest it if you haven't already. I would assume a lot of you already have, because I remember talking about you to some of my sort of YouTube friends, I suppose. And I think you're one of the ones that I've been really wanting to get on because, as I said, you offer something unique that not many others I've seen really do. The only one that I could really compare you to would be like Josh Snares. I don't know whether you ever watched.
I am aware, yeah. I haven't spoken to him. I must admit, I don't bear him any ill will, but I was slightly jealous when he appeared in Doctor Who magazine and I didn't. I'm not sure, but yeah, whatever. Yeah, no, I think, I was quite impressed by the quality of his productions and his focus on. He's definitely he's a big fan of the First Doctor, so there's that kind of niche of looking at the real classic Doctor Who, which perhaps not many people do.
But yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you